Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. As the day settles into its final hours, allow yourself to release the lingering weight of the conversations you have carried. The echoes of spoken words, the subtle pressures of social expectations, and the fatigue of being available to others can now be set aside. You are no longer required to explain, to listen, or to participate in the world of exchange. If you find these weekly chronicles a comfort in the dark, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these unhurried journeys into the past. We turn our attention now to the life of a great ship, a structure of iron and elegance that briefly inhabited the surface of the sea before finding a permanent home in its depths. It is a chronicle of grand designs and the patient movement of time across the water. The shipyard gates are open, and the history is waiting to begin. Chapter 1: The London Conception. It was the summer of 1907, a season characterized by a heavy, humid warmth that seemed to settle deeply into the stone and brickwork of London. It was then that the initial architecture of the Olympic-class liners began to take a definitive physical form. The evening air hung still in the neighborhood of Belgravia, where the grand residences stood as monuments to the stability of the Edwardian era. It was a time when the world felt both vast and entirely manageable through the application of industry and wealth. Within one of these homes, Downshire House, the lamps were dimmed to a soft golden glow. The light caught the edges of heavy mahogany furniture and the deep greens of velvet curtains. The conversation held within these walls was not a matter of public record at the time. Yet it carried the weight of thousands of tons of steel and the future of maritime travel. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, sat across from his host, Lord William Peary, the chairman of the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Ismay was a man of precise habits and a keen understanding of the social expectations of his class. He viewed the expansion of his shipping empire as both a personal legacy and a necessary response to a changing world. Peary, an engineer by training and a visionary by temperament, possessed a mind that naturally organized the chaos of a shipyard into the clean geometric lines of a hull. Together, they represented a partnership between capital and craft that had already produced some of the most recognizable vessels on the Atlantic. Yet the project they were contemplating that evening was intended to dwarf everything that had come before. Silverware and fine porcelain rested on the white linen tablecloth. These were the remnants of a dinner that had been served with the quiet efficiency expected in a house of such standing. The menu had been an exercise in the measured luxury that would later become a hallmark of their new ships. It featured courses of poached salmon and roasted meats that arrived and vanished without a sound from the staff. As the plates were cleared, the scent of expensive cigar smoke began to drift through the room. It mingled with the aroma of aged brandy that caught the light in delicate crystal snifters. It was a setting of immense comfort, one that stood in stark contrast to the cold, spray-lashed reality of the North Atlantic. Yet it was precisely this sense of domestic tranquility that they intended to replicate on a scale never before imagined. While the formal service concluded, Lord Peary reached for a linen napkin. He smoothed it out against the polished edge of the dining table with a slow, deliberate movement of his hand. He took a pencil from his pocket and began to sketch. his strokes light but confident as he outlined the profile of a ship that would dominate the horizon. He drew the long, elegant curve of a bow and the steady, upright lines of 4 funnels. He explained to Ismay how a ship of this magnitude would require a new approach to buoyancy and balance. The sketch on the napkin was small, a miniature representation of an idea. But as Ismay leaned in to study the proportions, the abstract figures of displacement and length began to coalesce into a vision of a floating world. A certain characteristic of the Edwardian mind was its unwavering belief that size was not merely a boast, but a technical solution to the inherent instability of the natural world. To the men in that room, a larger ship was inherently a safer ship. They envisioned a vessel whose sheer mass would allow it to ride over the swells of the ocean rather than being tossed by them. They viewed the North Atlantic not as an adversary to be feared, but as a medium to be crossed with predictable grace. It was to be like a carriage ride through Hyde Park. This interpretive lens provided the moral and intellectual foundation for the construction of the Titanic and her sisters. Progress was seen as a linear ascent toward greater and greater scale. Competition from the Cunard Line had recently intensified with the arrival of the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These 2 ships had captured the public imagination by breaking speed records with their innovative steam turbines. These vessels were sleek and narrow, designed to cut through the water with a predatory efficiency. They appealed to those for whom time was the ultimate commodity. Ismay and Peary, however, recognized that they could not easily compete with the raw velocity of the Cunarders without sacrificing the qualities of the White Star brand. They chose instead to pivot away from the pursuit of speed. They decided that their new class of ships would be defined by an unprecedented degree of space, stillness, and material opulence. Ismay and Peary spoke late into the night about the concept of the floating hotel. This was a term that was becoming more than just a metaphor in their planning sessions. They imagined a ship where the vibration of the engines would be so dampened as to be imperceptible to a passenger reading in the library. The dining saloon would be large enough to host hundreds of guests in a single sitting without a sense of crowding. The goal was to remove the anxiety of the sea from the experience of the voyage. They wanted an environment so stable and so richly appointed that the passenger might momentarily forget they were suspended over 2 miles of dark water. Size, they agreed, would be the primary instrument of this comfort. They set the target length at nearly 900 feet. This was a figure that challenged the existing infrastructure of the maritime world. It required new slipways in Belfast and the dredging of harbors in New York and Southampton. The tonnage was projected to exceed 45,000. This mass of steel would make the Titanic the largest man-made moving object on the planet. As they discussed these numbers, the scale of the ambition seemed to fill the room. The quiet Belgravia dining room became a temporary headquarters for a project that would require the labor of thousands. Within the walls of Downshire House, the administrative details were handled with calm authority. They discussed the necessity of 3 ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. This would ensure a weekly service that would be as regular and reliable as a train schedule. By building 3 identical hulls, they could achieve an economy of scale in the shipyard. It was a strategy of redundancy and reliability. It was an attempt to impose a sense of industrial order upon the unpredictable rhythms of the Atlantic trade. Lord Peary's vision for the interior was particularly focused on the grand staircase. He believed this architectural feature would serve as the social heart of the ship. He described a descent of polished oak and wrought iron topped by a glass dome. This would allow the pale light of the North Atlantic to filter down into the very center of the vessel. This was to be a space of theater where the wealthy and the influential could see and be seen. It reinforced the social hierarchies that were so central to Edwardian life. Even in these early planning stages, the ship was being designed as a stage. It was for the performance of a specific kind of civilized existence. Figures representing the cost of such an undertaking were staggering. There was an estimated price tag of £1.5 million for each ship. In 1907, this was an investment of nearly astronomical proportions. Yet Ismay did not hesitate, confident in the backing of the International Mercantile Marine Company. The funding of the Titanic was a testament to the era's vast accumulations of private wealth. It reflected the belief that capital should be used to push the boundaries of the possible. They were not merely building a ship, they were investing in the idea of permanent technological triumph. By the hour the brandy decanter sat nearly empty, the fundamental agreement was solidified. The candles had burned down to their silver holders in the deep of the night. There were no contracts signed that night, and no legal teams present to parse the language. It was a pact between a shipbuilder and a ship owner who had worked together for decades. They shook hands in the dim light of the hallway. This gesture of mutual trust carried more weight than any formal document. The silence of the house seemed to absorb the enormity of what they had just set in motion, a project that would soon transition from the realm of conversation to the roar of the shipyard. Coffee settled in porcelain cups as they spoke one last time of naming conventions. The names were chosen to evoke the Titans and the Olympians of Greek mythology. These were figures of immense power and size who stood at the beginning of the world. It was a choice that reflected the self-confidence of the age. There was no sense of hubris in their voices, only professional satisfaction. They believed they were providing a bridge across the ocean as solid as the earth itself. Orders were soon dispatched to the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. They began the necessary preparations for the construction of the first two hulls. This would involve the demolition of older slipways and the construction of the Errol gantry. This massive steel framework would provide the power needed to assemble the ships. The geography of the Queen's Island shipyard was about to be radically altered. The city of Belfast prepared to host the most significant industrial challenge in its history. The quiet planning of London was over. The era of iron and sweat was about to begin in the north. Mythic names and sketches on napkins were now to be translated into blueprints. The transition from the conceptual to the material was a process of immense complexity. It involved hundreds of draftsmen and engineers who would spend months refining the curves of the hull. They meticulously planned the layout of the boiler rooms. Every rivet, every beam, and every stateroom door had its origin in those summer decisions. The Titanic was no longer just a thought, it was a set of requirements. It would soon begin to consume vast quantities of iron ore and coal. In the cool, early morning air of the following day, J. Bruce Ismay returned to his residence. The city of London began to wake to its usual routines. The hansom cabs rattled over the cobblestones, and the first light of dawn touched the spires. It illuminated a world that had no idea its maritime future had just been reshaped. The dinner at Downshire House had concluded, and the participants had gone their separate ways. They left behind a quiet room and a linen napkin that would eventually be discarded. The journey of the Titanic had begun, moving out from the heart of the empire. It moved toward the shipyards of the north and eventually toward the sea. Chapter 2: The Iron Forests of Belfast. Steel of a density and scale rarely seen began to arrive at the Queen's Island shipyards. It was transported across the Irish Sea from the foundries of Scotland and the north of England. These massive plates were some over 30 feet in length and weighed several tons each. They were the fundamental units of a construction process that would consume more iron than any project in history. It was a material that felt cold and unyielding to the touch, yet it possessed a hidden fluidity when subjected to the heat of the forge and hydraulic presses. The shipyard became a landscape of raw mineral wealth. The air was perpetually thick with the scent of coal smoke, sea salt, and the metallic tang of grinding iron. Rising above this industrial terrain was the Errol Gantry. This colossal steel structure acted as a skeletal cathedral for the growing holes. Standing over 200 feet high, it stretched nearly 900 feet along the River Lagan. The gantry was a marvel of Victorian engineering that provided the framework for the heavy machinery. Its lattice work of girders and walkways created a permanent shadow over the slipways. It was a complex geometry of lines and angles that seemed to reach toward the gray Belfast sky. To the residents of the city, the gantry was a new landmark. It was a sign that the local economy was now tied to the success of the White Star Line. Within the confines of this steel forest, the labor of 15,000 men created a rhythmic environment. This percussive sound persisted from dawn until the fall of night. The shipyard was a world of specialized guilds, where shipwrights and joiners worked in a coordinated dance. Plumbers and electricians were managed with the precision of a military operation. These men lived in the narrow terraced houses that radiated out from the shipyard gates. Their lives were measured by the sounding of the morning whistle. There was a quiet dignity in the work and a sense of participating in something great. They were creating something that would outlast their own tenure in the yard. Massive hydraulic rams were used to press the heavy keel plates into position. This process required a delicate balance of brute force and mathematical accuracy. The keel was the spine of the vessel, the foundation upon which every other element would rest. Its alignment was checked and rechecked by Thomas Andrews and his team. They moved through the construction site with their rolled blueprints and measuring tapes. Their presence was a reminder of the rigorous intellectual order behind the noise. The laying of the first keel plates in March of 1909 marked the true beginning. It was the moment when the drawings finally met the reality of the Irish soil. Lord Peary's organization of the yard ensured that construction proceeded alongside the Olympic. The two ships grew in tandem like giant twins of iron. This dual construction required an immense logistical effort. Materials had to be managed across both slipways without causing a bottleneck. The aero gantry was equipped with a system of mobile cranes that could traverse the length of the hulls. They lowered beams and plates into position with a slow, grinding grace. It was a process of accumulation where the ship was gradually revealed, one layer of steel at a time, until the structure began to dominate the riverfront. A specific cadence governed the assembly of the hull, dictated by the movement of the riveting squads. They worked in the narrow gaps between the inner and outer skins. These squads were the heartbeat of the shipyard, consisting of 4 men working in intuitive harmony. They secured the 3 million rivets that held the Titanic together. The noise they generated was a continuous roar that could be heard miles away in Belfast. Yet within the squad, communication was often handled through simple gestures. They moved across the steel plates with a practiced ease. Their boots found purchase on the wet iron as the ship rose higher into the gantry. Beneath the scaffolding, the air was often choked with the fumes from the coke-fired furnaces. These were used to heat the rivets to a malleable, white-hot state. Small, portable hearths were scattered throughout the construction site. They glowed like embers in the dim recesses of the hull as the afternoons faded. The heat from the furnaces provided a brief, localized relief from the biting winds, though the men had little time to linger near the flames. The pace of production was relentless, and the demand for heated rivets was constant. It required a supply chain extending to the highest reaches of the boat deck. High up on the staging, perched on narrow wooden planks, the youngest members performed their tasks. These planks vibrated with every strike of the hammer. These were the heater boys, often teenagers who had followed their fathers into the trade. Their role was to manage the furnaces and ensure a steady flow of hot iron. They occupied a precarious position in the hierarchy of the yard. They were situated between the heat of the forge and the cold depths of the slipway. Their day was spent in a constant state of motion. They tended the fires and monitored the temperature of the rivets with an apprentice's eye. Here, a heater boy would reach into the heart of the furnace with long-handled tongs. He would pluck a single glowing rivet from the coals. He checked its color against the dim light of the gantry. Once satisfied the iron was soft, he would pivot toward the hull with a fluid motion. He would hurl the glowing projectile toward the catcher. The rivet would arc through the air like a falling star, trailing a faint wisp of smoke. The catcher would intercept the rivet with a small tin bucket. The metallic clink was lost in the clamor before the iron was driven home. These boys were masters of a dangerous and delicate choreography. They repeated the throw and catch hundreds of times a day without a break in the rhythm. If a rivet was allowed to cool even slightly, it would fail to form a perfect seal. This mistake would require the work to be redone by the inspectors. The pressure to maintain the flow was immense, yet the boys moved with a calm confidence that belied their young age. Their movements were integrated into the larger machinery of the construction. They were the connective tissue of the riveting process. Thousands of tons of steel plates were eventually secured in this manner. They created a double-bottomed hull designed to be as robust as a fortress. This inner skin provided an extra layer of protection against the hazards of the sea. It was a design feature that Peary and Ismay believed made the ship immune to danger. The space between the two skins was divided into a honeycomb of watertight compartments. This gave rise to the ship's reputation for being unsinkable. This reputation was a quiet consensus that grew among the engineers and the public. They watched the massive structure take shape day by day. Industrial landscapes of this scale often possess a gravity. They pull the surrounding culture into their orbit. Belfast was no exception during the years of construction. The city's identity was forged in the heat of the Harland and Wolff furnaces. The pride of the workforce was evident in the meticulous care they took. This was true for even the most hidden elements of the ship. Every plate was planed and fitted with a degree of precision. The ship was a mirror of the city itself, industrious and stoic. Along the hull, the names of the workers were never recorded in the iron, yet their presence was felt in the quality of the finish and the solidity of the joints. They worked through the heavy rains of the Irish spring and the snows of winter. The weather was only a minor inconvenience in the face of the schedule. The Titanic was becoming a physical reality, a wall of steel rising high. It began to obscure the view of the river for those on the opposite bank. It was a weight of 26,000 tons that pressed down upon the slipway. It sat with a quiet potential energy. Winter in the shipyard brought a different kind of intensity. The short hours of daylight required the use of thousands of electric lamps. The site became a nocturnal world of shadows and artificial light. Sparks from the grinding wheels fell like rain against the dark iron. The cold turned the steel into a heat sink that pulled warmth from hands. Yet the work continued without pause, driven by the fixed launch date. There was a peculiar beauty in the sight of the gantry at night. It was a glowing monument set against the black waters of the Lagan. By the early months of 1911, the external hull was largely complete. The focus of the yard began to shift toward the interior structures. The decks were laid down, and heavy foundations for the engines were secured. These were placed deep within the bowels of the ship. The sheer scale of the internal spaces was difficult to comprehend. It was a labyrinth of steel corridors and cavernous holds. The ship was still a hollow shell, yet the air within it felt different. It was still, expectant, and insulated from the outside world. Every plate and every beam had been scrutinized by the Board of Trade inspectors. They moved through the ship with a quiet authority. Their approval was necessary for the ship to proceed to the next stage. The relationship between builders and regulators was one of respect. There were no shortcuts taken in the construction of Hull 401. The standards of the era demanded craftsmanship as a matter of ethics. The ship was being built to endure. It was meant to cross the Atlantic for decades as a servant of the Empire. Such was the state of the Titanic as the spring of 1911 arrived. It stood as a finished sculpture of iron that was ready for the water. The Aral gantry was now a constraint that needed to be removed. It had protected and facilitated the growth for over 2 years. Preparations for the launch were underway, a logistical challenge. It required the coordination of hundreds of men and massive amounts of lubricant. The era of construction was drawing to a close. The ship was about to transition from a static object to a participant in the sea. The hull stood silent for a brief moment before the final preparations. It was a massive monument to the industry of Belfast. It was a structure that possessed a quiet, latent power. The material accomplishment justified the immense confidence of its creators. The iron forest of the gantry had done its work. The Titanic was now a singular entity, carrying the hopes of those who touched it. The water of the lagoon waited just a few yards away. This medium would eventually carry this weight of iron out into the wider world. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Luxury. Thomas Andrews moved through the skeletal corridors of the ship with a quiet, habitual focus. He saw the structure not as an assembly of parts, but as a living organism. As the managing director of the design department, he had been present for every iteration of the blueprints. Yet he preferred the physical reality of the decks to the abstraction of the drafting room. He carried a small notebook bound in dark leather, its pages filled with meticulous observations. These notes regarded the placement of a rivet or the swing of a door. To Andrews, the ship was a collection of thousands of small decisions. Each one contributed to the overall harmony of a machine intended to be the pinnacle of human achievement. The phase known as fitting out brought a shift in the shipyard's atmosphere. The heavy labor of the riveting squads gave way to the delicate precision of craftsmen and decorators. Thousands of specialized workers, plasters, wood carvers, electricians, and French polishers descended upon the hall. They began the transformation of raw steel into a sequence of opulent rooms. The sound of heavy hammers was replaced by the high-pitched whine of saws. The soft, rhythmic brushing of varnish onto oak panels filled the air. It was a time of immense logistical complexity. Materials arrived from across Europe to be integrated into the ship's increasingly sophisticated interior. Down in the lower decks, the air was cooler and smelled of fresh timber. It carried the scent of linseed oil used to treat the massive oak beams that formed the cabin framing. These spaces were the first to receive their final appointments. The third-class accommodations were prepared with a focus on hygiene and durability. While these rooms were simple, they represented a significant advancement over previous generations. They offered painted white walls and electric lighting that provided a sense of dignity to the emigrant experience. The ship was being built from the bottom up. This foundation of practical comfort would support the more elaborate layers above. Central to the interior design was the grand staircase. This feature transcended mere functionality to become a statement of the era's social and aesthetic values. Carved from solid English oak in the William and Mary style, the staircase descended through 5 decks. Its balustrades were decorated with intricate wrought iron and bronze foliage. At the center of the first landing sat a large clock. It was surrounded by an ornate carving representing honor and glory crowning time. This space was designed for the slow, ceremonial movement of the wealthy. It was a theater of wood and light topped by a massive glass dome. The dome allowed the pale sun to filter down into the very heart of the vessel. It created a cathedral of industry and refinement. While inspecting the first-class staterooms on B deck, Andrews paused before a series of brass coat hooks. These had just been installed by a junior joiner. He ran his hand over the metal, then produced his notebook. He recorded the necessity of lowering them by a fraction of an inch to better accommodate the varied heights of the passengers. This was the nature of his stewardship, a devotion to the smallest human interaction with the machine. He ensured that no detail was too insignificant to escape his notice. He believed that the success of the Titanic lay in these invisible adjustments. These quiet calibrations would make the voyage feel effortless and refined. Interior aesthetics followed the diverse tastes of the European aristocracy. Rooms were designed in the styles of Louis XVI, Regency, and Queen Anne. The first-class lounge was modeled after the Palace of Versailles. It featured carved wall panels and a fireplace of gray marble that gave the room a sense of terrestrial permanence. In the reading and writing room, the light was softened by silk curtains. The glow of silver-plated lamps created a space where the noise of the ocean was replaced by the quiet scratch of a pen. These environments were constructed to insulate the passenger from the reality of the Atlantic. They wrapped them in a familiar terrestrial luxury. Within the Turkish bath suite, the walls were lined with hand-painted tiles. They reflected the light in a spectrum of deep blues, golds, and terracottas. This was a space of humid warmth and exotic textures. It featured a cooling room decorated in the Moorish style with low-set divans and ornate fountains. The floor was made of cold, polished marble, providing a sensory contrast to the steam rooms. These lay just beyond the heavy, brass-bound doors. It was perhaps the most indulgent space on the ship. It was a retreat where the boundaries between sea and shore seemed to dissolve entirely into the mist. Second class offered a comfort that would have rivaled first class on many other vessels. It featured a dining saloon of impressive proportions and a library finished in polished sycamore. The third class, though Spartan, provided a cleanliness and light that many emigrants had never experienced. Common rooms allowed for social gathering away from the sleeping quarters. This social geography was mapped out in the very steel of the ship. It was a hierarchy of spaces that reflected the rigid class structure of 1912. Every deck was a world unto itself, governed by its own rhythms and expectations. Yet all were carried forward by the same singular purpose. Engineering served as the invisible spine of this luxury. It was hidden away behind the paneled walls and the heavy carpets of the upper decks. In the depths of the hull, the atmosphere was dominated by the immense scale of the propulsion system. A landscape of polished brass and cast iron hummed with a quiet, latent energy. This was the domain of the stokers and the engineers. It was a world of heat and shadow that remained entirely hidden from the view of the passengers above. The ship's ability to maintain its grace was dependent on the tireless work of these machines. They were kept in a state of constant, meticulous repair. The two reciprocating engines stood 4 stories high. Their massive steel pistons were capable of generating 30,000 combined horsepower. These engines were the largest of their kind ever constructed. They were designed to turn the propellers with a slow, deliberate cadence that minimized vibration. Each part was finished to a high polish, from the connecting rods to the massive crankshafts. These lay embedded in the floor of the engine room. To stand beside them was to feel the raw power of the Industrial Revolution. It was a mechanical force tamed and organized to serve the comforts of the modern age. Supplementing these was a central low-pressure turbine It utilized the exhaust steam from the reciprocating engines to drive the center propeller. This hybrid arrangement was a masterstroke of efficiency. It allowed the Titanic to maintain a high cruising speed while consuming less coal than its predecessors. The turbine was housed in its own compartment at the aft of the ship. It was a large humming cylinder of steel that operated with a smoothness that was almost eerie. It was a quiet contributor to the ship's stability. It provided the steady thrust needed to cross the thousands of miles of open water. 3 propellers waited beneath the stern. Their blades were curved to grip the water with maximum efficiency. The 2 outer propellers were made of solid bronze and measured over 20 feet in diameter. The center one was a slightly smaller casting of manganese bronze that weighed 22 tons. These massive objects were the final link in the chain of propulsion. They were the points where energy was finally translated into movement. They sat in the cold, dark water of the harbor. They were ready to begin the work of pushing 45,000 tons of steel across the horizon. Silence was the ultimate goal for the engineers. They used heavy lead shielding and layers of cork insulation to ensure that the mechanical roar was reduced to a hum. They understood that luxury was as much about what could be heard as what could be seen. They went to great lengths to dampen the sounds of the pumps and the ventilators. The result was a ship that felt strangely still. The movement of the ocean was felt only as a slow, rhythmic sway. It was a triumph of acoustic engineering. It was a way of masking the ship's industrial nature behind a veil of quietude. Andrews knew the ship's internal geography better than any other man. He had memorized the path of every steam pipe and the location of every electrical junction. He spent his evenings walking the corridors after the workers had gone home. He checked the finish of the woodwork and the tightness of the brass fittings. He was a man who found peace in the order of the machine. He saw in the Titanic a reflection of the precision and care that he demanded of himself. His relationship with the vessel was deeply personal. It was a bond formed through years of constant, unhurried attention to detail. Varnish and fresh paint finally began to cover the raw steel of the upper decks. This turned the cavernous industrial space into a sequence of rooms that felt grounded and permanent. The smell of the shipyard was gradually replaced by the scent of new carpets. The faint aroma of cedar wood from the furniture began to fill the air. The ship was becoming an inhabited space even before the first passenger had stepped on board. It was a transformation that felt almost miraculous. It was a metamorphosis of metal into a palace. It was a structure that seemed to possess its own quiet dignity. This transformation was a slow accumulation of detail. It reached from the silver-plated light fixtures to the thousands of yards of Axminster carpet. Every item had been selected to reinforce the sense of a secure world. From the heavy crystal glassware to the linen sheets, everything was infinitely refined. The Titanic was no longer just a project of Harland and Wolff. It was a physical manifestation of the Edwardian belief in the permanence of their civilization. It stood in the Belfast harbor as a completed work of art, a structure of iron and elegance that was ready to face the sea. As the final touches were applied, a sense of stillness settled over the decks. The last of the decorators had finally left the ship. The Titanic was complete, a floating world that carried within it the labor of thousands. It held the dreams of an empire within its steel walls. It was a moment of rest before the beginning of the voyage. It was a brief pause in the life of a vessel that had spent years in the making. The engines were silent, the lights were dimmed, and the ship waited in the darkness of the harbor. It stood as a silent monument to the architecture of luxury, about to move out into the wider world. Chapter 4: The Weight of the Launch. The River Lagan moved with a heavy tidal indifference on the final morning of May. Its gray-green waters swirled around the wooden pilings as they had for centuries. Beyond the narrow channel of the river, the Belfast Lough opened toward the sea. It provided a gateway for the massive industrial creations that defined the city's identity. The water was unusually still that day, reflecting the jagged silhouette of the Errol gantry. The sheer vertical wall of the Titanic's hull stood ready to transition. It was a geography of anticipation, where the solid earth met the fluid uncertainty of the tide. This was a boundary soon to be crossed by 26,000 tons of steel. On the morning of May 31, 1911, the atmosphere in Belfast was festive but disciplined. Nearly 100,000 people gathered along the banks to witness the birth of a giant. Crowds occupied every available vantage point, from rooftops to the decks of small ferries. They created a human tapestry of dark wool and white caps in the morning light. Lord Peary and J. Bruce Ismay arrived at the shipyard together. Their presence signaled the arrival of a moment that had been years in the making. They climbed to a specially constructed wooden grandstand draped in red and white bunting. It offered a clear view of the hull that loomed over the slipway like a cliff of iron. Lubrication of the slipway was the most critical technical requirement of the day. It involved the application of massive quantities of fats and oils to the wooden ways. This task required a peculiar blend of industrial scale and manual precision. Workers moved beneath the hull to prepare for the tremendous friction about to occur. The yard utilized over 20 tons of tallow and soft soap. This was reinforced by a layer of refined train oil that gave the timber a dark, viscous sheen. It was a primitive solution to a sophisticated engineering problem. The world's most advanced ship was dependent on the fundamental properties of material slip. A small group of workers moved through the shadows of the keel for several days. They meticulously spread the thick, pale tallow over the slipway by hand. They worked with large wooden spatulas and heavy brushes. They ensured the grease was applied to a uniform thickness that could withstand the crushing weight. One worker might pause to wipe his hands on a rag, the smell of the tallow clinging to his skin. It was a heavy animal scent that persisted long after the day's work was done. These men were the architects of the slide. They created a silent path that would allow the ship to move without the catastrophic heat of friction. Tradition at the White Star Line dictated a notable absence of typical launch ceremonies. There was no formal christening and no bottle of champagne shattered against the bow. Ismay and Peary believed such displays were unnecessary for a vessel of such inherent quality. They preferred a silent release that allowed the engineering to speak for itself. This lack of ritual gave the launch a character of professional confidence. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the ship was a product of calculation, rather than luck. The process of beating out the blocks was the final manual task. It required the coordination of hundreds of shipwrights working in the narrow space beneath the hull. At a given signal, these men used heavy sledgehammers to knock away the wooden shores. These were the wedges that had supported the ship's weight during its construction. The sound was a rhythmic, cascading thunder that echoed through the shipyard. It was a percussive announcement that the ship was being transferred from the earth to the slipway. As each block fell, the tension in the air seemed to increase. The entire mass of the Titanic was soon held in place by only a series of hydraulic triggers. Hydraulic triggers were the modern instruments of the release. They were designed to hold 26,000 tons of potential energy in check until high tide. These devices were situated at the head of the slipway. Their steel arms were locked against the sliding ways to prevent any premature movement. A single lever was the only thing that stood between the ship and the water. It was a mechanical pivot that concentrated the entire weight of the project into a single action. The responsibility for the release was a quiet burden. It was shared by the senior engineers who stood by the levers with their watches in hand. At 12:13 p.m., a signal flare arced over the shipyard. It left a trail of white smoke against the gray sky to announce that the tide was at its peak. Lord Peary gave the nod, and the hydraulic triggers were released. A dull subterranean thud vibrated through the wooden flooring of the grandstand. For a heartbeat, the ship remained motionless. It was a final moment of resistance as the mass struggled to overcome its own inertia. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible lurch, the Titanic began to move. The friction of the tallow created a low-pitched groan that rose from the depths of the slipway. Friction soon turned into velocity as the ship began to slide down the ways. It gathered speed that surprised many onlookers who had expected a hesitant descent. The heat generated by the movement caused the tallow to smoke. Plumes of gray vapor curled up around the hull as it descended toward the river. This was the smell of the launch, a mixture of burning fat and hot timber. It was mixed with the sharp ozone of the river air. The ship moved with a graceful, unhurried power. Its stern met the water first, sending a broad white wake surging across the narrow channel. The slide lasted exactly 62 seconds. It was a minute of transition that felt both fleeting and eternal to those who had built it. During this time, the Titanic was neither of the land nor of the sea. It was a suspended entity that occupied the space between its past and its future. As the bow finally cleared the end of the slipway, a tremendous splash erupted. The ship settled into its natural element with a slow, rhythmic bob. The crowd, which had been held in a state of breathless silence, erupted into a roar. Cheers and whistles drowned out the sound of the receding tide. The launch of a great ship is the only moment when its vulnerability is entirely exposed. On the slipway, the vessel is a rigid sculpture, but in the water it becomes a participant. The transition is a violent one, involving the sudden displacement of thousands of tons of water. It is the immediate stress of buoyancy on a hull that has spent its life supported by the earth. This quiet irony was not lost on the engineers who watched from the bank. Their faces reflected a mixture of relief and professional pride. The ship's first success was to survive its own birth. It sat now in the river, a living thing for the very first time. Control was now the primary concern for the shipyard teams. The momentum of the launch threatened to carry the ship into the opposite bank. To prevent this, the yard utilized a system of massive drag chains. 6 in total, they were attached to the hull and piled in large heaps along the slipway. As the ship moved into the river, these chains were pulled taut. They dug into the earth and created a tremendous resistance that slowed the vessel's progress. The sound of the chains rattling over the ground was a harsh, industrial music. It was a necessary friction that brought the Titanic to a halt in the center of the channel. Lord Peary and J. Bruce Ismay stood in silence for a moment after the ship had settled. They watched as the hull sat high in the water, an empty shell. The red lead paint of the lower hull gleamed in the afternoon light. The lack of funnels gave the vessel a skeletal, unfinished appearance. Yet the fundamental achievement was undeniable. The world's largest ship was afloat. The engineering of the White Star Line had once again proven its mastery. They descended from the grandstand to begin the walk toward the offices. Their work for the day was concluded, but the next phase was already in motion. Tugs soon moved in to take charge of the hull. Their small, sturdy frames appeared dwarfed by the sheer scale of the vessel. The Hercules and the Vulcan nudged the Titanic into the center of the river. Their engines churned the water into a frothy, white foam. They began the slow process of towing the hull around the Queen's Island toward the Deepwater Wharf. This was where the fitting out would begin in earnest. The ship moved with a new, fluid grace. It was a silent participant in the tow as it left the slipway behind forever. Launch displacement was recorded at approximately 26,000 tons. This represented only a fraction of what the ship would eventually weigh. The hull drew nearly 18 feet of water at the stern. This draft required careful navigation through the dredged channels of the Lagan. As the ship rounded the bend in the river, the atmosphere began to return to routine. The slipway sat empty and scarred, a field of broken wood and grease. This space would soon be cleared to make room for the next great project. The echoes of the launch began to fade into the history of the yard. A floating entity now existed where there had previously been only a construction site. The life of the Titanic had officially begun. The ship sat at the wharf in the evening light, its long profile reflected in the still basin. The noise of the crowds had faded entirely into the twilight. The only sound was the lap of the tide against the steel plates of the hull. It was a moment of rest before the arrival of the massive boilers and the 4 funnels. The weight of the launch had been successfully managed. The journey toward the open sea was now one step closer to reality. Chapter 5: The Southampton Gathering. Wednesday morning, April 10, 1912, brought a cool, salt-tinged mist that rolled off the Solent and hung over the port city of Southampton. This was a day defined by a complex choreography of movement. Thousands of people converged upon the White Star dock to board a vessel that had occupied the public imagination for months. The docks themselves were a labyrinth of railway lines, brick warehouses, and massive cranes. It was an industrial landscape that had been temporarily transformed into a theater of departure. Southampton was not merely a point of embarkation. It was the final terrestrial connection before the vast isolation of the Atlantic, a place where the noise of the city met the quiet enormity of the sea. Captain Edward J. Smith made his final preparations at his modest red brick home in the leafy suburbs of the city. He was a man of 62 years, possessing a silver beard and a bearing that projected a calm, absolute authority. These traits had earned him the title of the millionaire's captain. Smith had spent a lifetime on the water, navigating the transition from sail to steam. This voyage was widely rumored to be his final command before retirement. The responsibility of moving 46,000 tons of steel out of a crowded harbor rested squarely upon his shoulders. Yet he moved with the measured pace of a man who found comfort in the routine of command. Smith's morning began with the donning of his uniform. It was a ritual of brass buttons and heavy wool that he performed with the automatic precision of decades of service. He kissed his wife, Eleanor, goodbye at the front door. The interaction was brief and understated, as was the custom of the era for a man departing on a short voyage. He stepped out onto the damp pavement and walked toward the waiting cab. The sound of his footsteps was a quiet cadence against the backdrop of the waking city. It was a mundane departure for a man about to take command of the world's most famous ship. It was a final moment of domestic normalcy before stepping onto the stage of history. Arrival at the White Star Dock presented the captain with the sheer physical presence of his command. The Titanic sat alongside berth 44, its 4 buff-colored funnels reaching high above the warehouse roofs. Its black hull stretched for nearly 3 city blocks. The sheer mass of the vessel seemed to alter the local geography, creating its own shadows and wind currents within the harbor. Loading operations were in full swing, a process involving the continuous movement of supplies and baggage up the gangways and into the cavernous holds. The ship was a hungry machine. It required a staggering amount of material to sustain its passengers and crew for the duration of the crossing. A significant logistical challenge had arisen in the weeks prior to the departure. A national coal miners' strike had threatened the fuel supply of the entire British merchant fleet. To ensure the Titanic had enough coal, the White Star Line had been forced to cancel the sailings of several other ships. They transferred those fuel stores to the new liner. Over 6,000 tons of coal had been loaded into the Titanic's bunkers. This was a dirty, exhausting process that had left a fine layer of black dust over the lower decks. This massive reservoir of energy was the prerequisite for the ship's speed and power. Yet it arrived through manual labor entirely at odds with the clean elegance of the upper decks. Loading the provisions for the crossing required an organization akin to provisioning a small seaborne town. The victualling department moved thousands of crates and barrels down the gangways. They filled the refrigerated storerooms with an abundance that reflected the era's belief in unending plenty. They loaded 40,000 fresh eggs, 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, and 1,000 bottles of wine. Each item was tallied and stowed by quartermasters who worked with a clipboard and a sharp pencil. This quiet accumulation of material was the foundation of the ship's luxury. It was an invisible logistics chain that allowed the dining saloons to function with the seamless grace of a fine restaurant. Passenger arrival began mid-morning, with different classes utilizing separate gangways. This established the social hierarchy before they had even set foot on the decks. The boat trains from London arrived directly at the dockside. They discharged the wealthy and the titled into a flurry of porters and White Star officials. The first-class passengers moved up the covered walkways with an air of casual entitlement. Their arrival was a quiet procession of heavy trunks and expensive furs. They were entering a world designed specifically to cater to their comfort. It was a familiar environment of wood paneling and attentive service that just happened to be floating on the water. Third-class passengers underwent a very different boarding process. It was characterized by the noise and confusion of hundreds of people navigating a foreign environment. They were directed toward the stern gangways. Their passage was marked by the mandatory health inspections required by the American immigration authorities. These were families from across Europe, carrying their belongings in woven bags and cheap suitcases. For them, the voyage was not a vacation, but a one-way passage to a new life. The ship offered them a cleanliness and a regularity of meals that was perhaps unprecedented in their lives. Yet their presence was physically separated from the luxury above by a series of locked gates. By noon, the sirens of the Titanic sounded a deep, resonant blast that echoed across the Solent. This was the signal that the shorelines were about to be cast off. The gangways were pulled back, severing the physical connection to the earth. Tugs moved in to begin the delicate process of pulling the massive hull away from the dock. The vibration of the reciprocating engines began to be felt through the decks. This was a low, rhythmic thumping that signaled the awakening of the ship's internal power. The harbor was crowded with other vessels. It was a cramped environment that required the utmost skill to navigate without incident. As the Titanic moved slowly down the River Test, its sheer size began to exert a dangerous physical force. The displacement of 46,000 tons created an immense suction. This was a powerful current that pulled at the smaller ships moored along the banks. It was a graphic illustration of the physical reality that lay beneath the luxury. It was a reminder that the ship was a massive object bound by the laws of fluid dynamics. This suction was a consequence of the vessel's unprecedented mass. It was an element of navigation that even experienced pilots were only beginning to understand. Passing the moored liner SS City of New York, the suction generated by the Titanic's propellers proved too great. The smaller ship's hawsers were strained to their limit. With a sound like a pistol shot, the heavy mooring lines snapped. The city of New York began to swing out into the channel, its stern drawn inexorably toward the towering side of the Titanic. The sudden, violent movement broke the calm of the departure. Crews of both ships scrambled to avert a collision that could have ended the maiden voyage before it had truly begun. Captain Smith ordered the port engine reversed. The massive pistons changed direction with a juddering thud that vibrated through the steel of the hull. He also directed the tug Vulcan to move in and pull the city of New York away. It was a maneuver executed with calm precision in a moment of intense pressure. The two ships missed each other by perhaps 4 feet. The margin was so narrow that passengers leaning over the rails claimed they could have tossed a coin onto the deck of the smaller vessel. The incident was a brief, sharp reminder of the ship's massive inertia. It highlighted the inherent dangers of operating such a large vessel in a confined space. It is interesting to note how quickly the anxiety of a near collision dissipates once the immediate danger has passed. The passengers, initially alarmed by the shouts, quickly returned to their deck chairs. They perhaps assumed that such close calls were simply a part of the maritime experience. The incident was absorbed into the narrative of the departure as an exciting anecdote rather than a portent. The Edwardian confidence in the ship's invulnerability was so profound that even a visible demonstration of its dangerous mass was interpreted as a triumph of skill. With the channel cleared, the Titanic resumed its slow passage down the Solent. It passed the green slopes of the Isle of Wight as it headed toward the open waters of the English Channel. The rhythm of the voyage began to assert itself. It was a steady cadence dictated by the turning of the propellers and the regular sounding of the ship's bell. The noise and smoke of Southampton fell away behind them. It was replaced by the clean smell of the sea and the steady, cold wind of the passage. The ship was finally in its element. It moved with a grace that belied the massive industrial effort required to build it. The gathering at Southampton was complete, and the population of the floating city was now sealed within its steel borders. It was a community that was entirely self-sufficient, carrying its own power and its own rigid social structure. The first leg of the journey, the short crossing to the French port of Cherbourg, was an opportunity for the crew to test the systems. It allowed passengers to find their cabins and their sea legs. The mist had lifted, and the water was relatively calm. The Titanic steamed southward, a triumph of material engineering carrying the hopes and the hubris of its age. Chapter 6: The Gates of Europe. Cherbourg Harbor appeared as a distant constellation of amber lights against the deepening blue of the French coastline. The Titanic approached on the evening of April 10. The harbor was shielded by massive stone breakwaters and ancient fortresses. It was not deep enough to accommodate a vessel of such immense draft. This required the ship to drop anchor in the outer roadstead. The water here was dark and restless, reflecting the glow from the stateroom portholes. The lights lined the hull like a string of pearls. It was a brief transitional pause, a moment where the industrial energy met the quiet continental elegance of the European travelers. Two specialized tenders, the nomadic and the traffic, moved out from the Quai de France to meet the towering wall of the liner. The nomadic was designed by the same architects who had conceived the Titanic. It was a miniature masterpiece of luxury, intended to ferry first and second class passengers with refinement. Its small cabins were finished in polished mahogany, and its decks were scrubbed to a pristine white. This provided a seamless transition for the wealthy elite. The traffic, meanwhile, carried the heavier burden of third-class passengers. It held the hundreds of trunks and crates that constituted the worldly possessions of the voyagers. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, boarded the ship at Cherbourg. He was accompanied by his young wife, Madeline. Their arrival was a quiet affair, marked by the presence of several servants and a substantial amount of luggage. Yet it carried an immense social weight. Alongside them came other luminaries of the Gilded Age, including the unsinkable Molly Brown and Benjamin Guggenheim. Each brought a fragment of their terrestrial influence into the floating world. These figures moved through the shell door entrances in the hull. They disappeared into the warm, paneled interior of the reception room as the tenders bobbed in the Atlantic swell. Father Francis Brown, a Jesuit seminarian and an avid photographer, occupied a unique position among the passengers. He had received a ticket from his uncle as a gift. He spent his time on the ship documenting the transition from Europe to the sea with a professional eye. He captured the grain and composition of life on board. He moved along the boat deck with his camera. He captured images of children playing near lifeboats and the focused work of the officers on the bridge. These photographs would eventually become the most significant visual record of the ship's final days. They are a collection of moments frozen in time before the material reality vanished. April 11 brought a clear, cold sunrise as the Titanic crossed the Irish Sea. They headed toward their final European port of call. The coast of County Cork emerged from the morning mist as a series of green, rolling hills and jagged cliffs. It was a landscape that felt ancient and enduring compared to the modern steel of the ship. Queenstown, now known as Cove, was a town defined by its relationship with emigration. Its harbor had served as the departure point for millions seeking a new life. The arrival of the world's largest ship was a local event of immense proportions. It drew crowds to the hillsides to watch the massive hull settle into the deep water outside the harbor. Queenstown Harbor, much like Cherbourg, required the use of tenders to bridge the gap. The Ireland and the America moved out toward the Titanic. Their decks were crowded with 113 third-class passengers who had traveled from all corners of the Irish countryside. These were young men and women, many carrying all they owned in small cloth bundles or wooden boxes. Their faces reflected a mixture of sorrow for the land they were leaving. They held hope for the one they had yet to see. They were the final pieces of the ship's human puzzle, the laborers and dreamers who would occupy the lowest decks. 1,385 sacks of mail were hoisted up the side of the ship at Queenstown. This was a massive accumulation of correspondence that represented the final ties. The postal clerks worked in the cramped, humid sorting rooms on G-Deck. They began the tireless task of organizing the letters by destination. Their hands moved with an automatic grace born of years of service. This mail was a silent passenger, a weight of paper and ink that carried private thoughts. The ship was a bridge for information as much as for people. It was a vital link in the global network of the British Empire. And yet, despite the industrial scale of the mail operation, it was the small, personal details that defined the departure. The smell of burning peat and damp wool drifted off the tenders. This was a scent that many of the passengers would later associate with their final moments on European soil. On the deck of one of the tenders, Eugene Daly produced a set of Julian pipes. He began to play Erin's Lament. The haunting melodic notes drifted across the water, a fragile sound that seemed to be swallowed by the immense scale of the hull. Yet it lingered in the memory of those who heard it. As the afternoon light began to soften over the Irish coast, the final whistles of the ship sounded. 3 deep, resonant blasts vibrated through the town of Queenstown. The tenders pulled away, their passengers waving handkerchiefs and shouting final farewells. These voices were quickly lost in the rising wind. The connection to Europe was being severed, not with a single dramatic act, but through mechanical steps. The anchor, a 15-ton mass of iron, was raised from the seabed. Its massive links rattled through the hawse holes with a sound like distant thunder. The physical sensation of the ship turning toward the open sea was felt by the passengers. It was a slow, rhythmic tilting of the horizon. The engines, which had been idling, began to churn the water into a broad white wake. The propellers gripped the Atlantic for the first time with their full power. The Titanic was no longer a visitor to the coastal waters. It was now a traveler of the deep, its bow pointed toward a horizon that offered no landmarks. The transition from the gates of Europe to the isolation of the ocean was complete. The ship moved with a new, purposeful speed. Eugene Daly put away his pipes and moved toward the third-class common room. He joined hundreds of other emigrants who were finding their berths. For these passengers, the cost of a ticket represented years of savings. It was a financial sacrifice that underscored the stakes of the voyage. They were entering a world of electric light and running water that was entirely foreign. It was a temporary palace offering a brief respite before the hard labor of the frontier. The social geography of the ship remained intact. The familiar geography of the land disappeared behind them. Turning south and then west, the ship passed the old head of Kinsale. This was the final lighthouse that would mark their departure from the British Isles. The light flashed rhythmically against the darkening sky. It was a steady, mechanical pulse that guided the ship out into the shipping lanes. The officers on the bridge watched the light fade into a tiny, flickering point. Finally, it vanished altogether beneath the curve of the earth. The Titanic was now alone on the Atlantic. It was a self-contained universe of steel and steam, carrying over 2,000 souls. The departure from Europe was a moment of profound finality. It was a transition from the known to the unknown, managed with calm efficiency. The ship's routine now became the only reality for the passengers and crew. The dinner bugles sounded for the first time on the open sea. This was a clear, brassy call that invited the travelers to forget the land they had left behind. In the first-class dining saloon, the tables were set with heavy silver and fine crystal. The light reflected off the wine glasses as the ship settled into its long stride. The old head of Kinsale was left far behind as the ship reached the edge of the continental shelf. The shallow coastal waters gave way to the deep blue-black abyss. The vibration of the engines reached a steady, comforting frequency. This was a heartbeat that would persist for the next 5 days. There was no longer any land in sight, only the vast, unchanging circle of the horizon. The steady, cold wind blew across the boat deck. The Titanic had passed through the gates of Europe. The journey toward the Western world had truly begun. Chapter 7: The Routine of the Deep. Friday, April 12, established the cadence of the crossing. The Titanic settled into the long, rhythmic stride required to traverse 3,000 miles of water. The ship was no longer a novelty or a point of departure. It was a functioning community suspended between continents, governed by a rigid internal clock. The weather remained fair, with a light wind that barely ruffled the surface. This allowed the vessel to maintain a speed of over 21 knots with remarkable smoothness. Passengers remarked, often with a sense of wonder, that they could stand a coin on edge. Such was the absence of vibration from the massive engines below. Life aboard the ship quickly stratified into familiar patterns. These were dictated by the architecture of the decks and the social expectations of the era. The first-class passengers engaged in a slow, elegant rotation of activities. They moved from the gymnasium in the morning to the reading room in the afternoon. The gymnasium, located on the boat deck, was a marvel of health technology. It featured electric camels, a mechanical horse, and a rowing machine bolted to the deck. Instructor Thomas Macaulay oversaw the exercises, his calm demeanor offering comfort. He assisted those adjusting to the novel sensation of exercising at sea. Meanwhile, the heart of the ship's communication lay hidden on the boat deck. This was the Marconi room, a small, windowless cabin. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride operated the most powerful wireless set ever installed on a vessel. They were employees of the Marconi Company rather than the White Star Line. The equipment was a tangle of heavy coils, copper wire, and brass keys. It was powered by a rotary spark transmitter that produced a deafening crackle. The room was heavily soundproofed. This necessary isolation allowed the operators to focus on the faint, rhythmic bursts of Morse code. Phillips, the senior operator, sat at the desk with headphones clamped tightly. His hands moved with practiced speed across the telegraph key. He was faced with an immense backlog of personal messages. These wish-you-were-here telegrams were the prerogative of the wealthy passengers. The cost of a transmission was exorbitant, nearly 12 shillings for 10 words. Yet the demand was unceasing, requiring Phillips and Bride to work in alternating shifts. The nature of their work was inherently solitary. They constantly strained to decipher signals amidst the static of the atmosphere. The operators were not merely sending greetings, they were the ship's ears. They received weather reports and ice warnings from vessels further along the route. In 1912, the wireless was still considered a passenger convenience rather than a safety tool. This meant commercial messages often took precedence over navigational data. The volume of outgoing traffic created a bottleneck in the small room. Stewards passed paper slips beneath the door, each one a fragment of a life waiting to be sent. This continuous flow was hurled into the void of the Atlantic air. Below decks, the routine was defined by the relentless demands of the propulsion system. In the boiler rooms, hundreds of stokers worked in oppressive heat. Known as the Black Gang, they worked to feed the ship's voracious appetite for coal. They worked in 4-hour shifts, stripped to the waist. They shoveled the black dust into the glowing mouths of the furnaces. It was a synchronized rhythm that bordered on an industrial ballet. The heat was immense, often exceeding 120 degrees. Men drank gallons of water to replace the sweat they lost to the fire. The engineers, led by Chief Joseph Bell, monitored the complex system. They oversaw the valves and gauges that distributed steam from the boilers. Their domain was a landscape of polished steel and brass. The smell of hot oil mixed with the rhythmic thumping of the massive pistons. It was a world entirely disconnected from the daylight and the sea air. It was a subterranean machine that provided the energy for effortless motion. They worked with a quiet, focused discipline. They made minor adjustments necessary to keep the ship moving at an optimal speed. A sense of isolation characterized the experience of the third-class passengers. They found their own rhythms in the less ornate spaces of the lower decks. Their days were spent in the common rooms, reading or playing cards. Some walked the open space of the well deck at the stern of the ship. The atmosphere here was boisterous and communal. It was filled with the sounds of different languages and the shared anticipation of America. They were separated from the wealth of the upper decks by locked gates. It was a physical manifestation of the social barriers that defined the era. The ship's printing press, located deep within the hull, produced the daily paper. The Atlantic Daily Bulletin provided news from the continent. The paper featured stock market reports and society gossip. It offered a fragile tether to the world they had left behind. It was a tangible artifact of the routine. It was a daily reminder that the ship was part of the global network. Even while surrounded by thousands of miles of empty water, they felt connected. Saturday, April 13, saw the weather remain calm and steady. However, the air temperature began to drop noticeably as the ship moved north and west. The passengers continued their routines, unaware of the subtle changes. Messages arriving in the Marconi room hinted at ice in the shipping lanes. The speed of the vessel increased slightly. The massive engines found their optimal rhythm after days of breaking in. They pushed the hull through the water with a quiet, undeniable force. The crossing had become an exercise in comfortable monotony. Evening brought a change in the social atmosphere as passengers dressed for dinner. The ship transformed into a floating palace of light and music. In the first-class dining saloon, tables were adorned with fresh flowers. Light from crystal chandeliers reflected off the polished wood paneling. The ship's orchestra, led by Wallace Hartley, played a selection of tunes. Their music provided a background to the conversations of the powerful. It was a scene of unparalleled luxury. It was a moment of terrestrial elegance suspended over the dark waters. The routine of the deep was a delicate construction. It was dependent on the machines below and the behavior of the ocean above. The passengers had surrendered themselves to the care of the White Star Line. They trusted in the sheer mass and the perceived invulnerability of the vessel. They slept in their soft beds, insulated from the cold. The ship drove onward through the night. The crossing had settled into a predictable rhythm. It was a journey that seemed destined to end as successfully as it had begun. Phillips remained at his post in the Marconi room late into the night. Static was occasionally broken by the sharp signal of a distant ship. He noted the weather reports and the ice warnings. He passed them along to the bridge when he could. However, the volume of passenger traffic remained his primary concern. The routine of the operators was defined by the relentless telegraph key. They were the ears of the Titanic, listening to the silent voices. They were unaware that these messages would soon become a matter of life and death. By Sunday morning, the air had grown biting and sharp. A chill drove many passengers from the open decks into the enclosed promenades. The routine of the ship continued, though the cold served as a subtle reminder. The ocean was a dynamic and unpredictable environment. The ship steamed onward, its massive hull cutting through the water. It moved closer to the invisible boundary of the North Atlantic ice fields. The routine of the deep was about to be broken. It was to be replaced by a sudden and irrevocable silence. Chapter 8: The Cold Horizon. Sunday, April 14, dawned clear and bitterly cold. It was a sharp contrast to the mild weather that had characterized the first few days of the crossing. The wind, which had been a gentle presence, dropped away entirely. It left the surface of the Atlantic as flat and featureless as a mirror. This stillness, often referred to by sailors as a mill pond sea, was a rare and unsettling phenomenon in the open ocean. It removed the telltale white water that usually breaks against the base of an obstacle. The temperature of the air dropped steadily throughout the day, driven by the Labrador Current. This was a massive flow of frigid water moving southward from the Arctic, carrying with it the silent debris of the Greenland glaciers. The drop in temperature was physically jarring to the passengers who ventured onto the boat deck. The sudden chill bit through heavy wool coats and drove them back to the enclosed promenades and the warmth of the steam-heated lounges. The air was so clear that the horizon seemed unusually sharp. It was a hard line separating the dark blue of the water from the pale, cloudless sky. It was a beautiful, severe landscape, a demonstration of the ocean's scale that felt entirely indifferent to the mechanical presence of the Titanic. The ship continued at a speed of over 22 knots, its massive engines unbothered by the cold. It pushed the bow through the flat water with a continuous rushing sound. In the Marconi room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride found themselves increasingly busy. They managed passenger traffic alongside a growing number of navigational warnings from other vessels in the area. Throughout the day, messages arrived from ships like the Caronia, the Baltic, and the America. All reported the presence of large ice fields and bergs in the direct path of the White Star liner. These messages were transcribed on small slips of paper and, when the operators had a moment to spare, carried to the bridge. The sheer volume of ice reported was unusual for the season. It was a consequence of an exceptionally mild winter in the Arctic that had caused an unprecedented calving of the glaciers. One specific warning arrived in the late afternoon from a steamer named the Mesaba. It detailed an enormous belt of heavy pack ice and large bergs stretching directly across the Titanic's course. This message, precise in its coordinates and explicit in its danger, was received by Phillips. He was struggling to send a backlog of passenger telegrams through the heavy static to the relay station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. Under the pressure of the commercial traffic, Phillips placed the Mesaba warning under a paperweight on his desk. He intended to deliver it to the bridge when he had cleared the current transmission. The slip of paper remained there, a piece of crucial intelligence trapped by the competing demands of the era's priorities. On the bridge, Captain Smith and his officers were aware that they were entering an ice region. However, the extent of the danger was perhaps masked by the clear weather and the ship's perceived invulnerability. They discussed the drop in temperature and the glassy state of the sea. These were conditions that made spotting a berg significantly more difficult without the aid of a moon or breaking waves. There was no discussion of reducing speed. Maintaining a strict schedule was the hallmark of the White Star Line's service, and a clear night was generally considered sufficient for avoiding large obstacles. The ship was performing beautifully, a massive arrow of steel moving toward New York. The momentum of the crossing seemed to require that they press on. As the sun set, the temperature plummeted further, dropping to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. This was 4 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water. The sky transitioned into a deep, star-filled black, untroubled by the glow of a moon. It provided a spectacular celestial display that many passengers observed from the enclosed decks before retiring for the evening. The cold was a physical weight settling over the ship and condensing the breath of the lookouts into small clouds of vapor. The water itself, though unfrozen due to its salinity, was lethally cold. It was a vast heat sink that absorbed the ambient warmth of the air and created a layer of frigid stillness. A subtle atmospheric optical illusion, later identified as a thermal inversion, began to distort the view from the bridge and the crow's nest. The layer of extremely cold air resting just above the water's surface refracted the starlight. It bent it slightly downward and created what navigators call a false horizon. This optical effect effectively raised the apparent line where the sky met the sea. It camouflaged objects that lay in the distance behind a wall of darkness. It was a silent trick of the atmosphere, an invisible condition that rendered the standard visual checks of the lookouts dangerously compromised. High above the boat deck, in the small exposed basket of the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee stood their 2-hour watch. They peered into the blackness ahead. They had no binoculars, a detail that would later become a point of intense scrutiny. Whether the glasses would have pierced the thermal inversion remains a matter of historical debate. Their job was one of intense, monotonous focus, scanning the flat water for the subtle shapes of ice that might interrupt the star field. The cold bit at their faces, and the wind generated by the ship's movement was a constant tearing force. It made the simple act of keeping their eyes open a physical strain. 10 miles away, the Leyland Line freighter Californian had encountered the ice field. Lacking the size and power of the Titanic, she had prudently stopped her engines for the night. The Californian's sole wireless operator, Cyril Evans, was preparing to shut down his equipment and go to sleep. Before doing so, he transmitted a final warning to any ships in the vicinity, noting that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. The signal blared into the headset of Jack Phillips with deafening volume, given the close proximity of the two ships. Exhausted and frustrated by the interruption to his work with Cape Race, Phillips snapped back over the telegraph key, "Shut up, shut up, I am working Cape Race." Evans, perhaps offended by the response, turned off his wireless set at 11:30 p.m. The Californian sat quietly in the ice, a dark silhouette against the white floes. Its only link to the Titanic was severed by a combination of fatigue and technical frustration. The silence that followed was profound, the ether returning to its natural state of static, while the Titanic continued its 22-knot charge into the darkness. The ship was now entirely dependent on the visual acuity of the two men in the crow's nest. They were navigating a sea that was hiding its dangers behind a veil of optical distortion. The horizon remained a solid, unbroken line of black. It offered no indication of the massive physical structure that lay directly in the ship's path. An iceberg, formed from the compressed snow of a Greenland glacier thousands of years before, had drifted south on the Labrador Current. Its vast bulk was hidden beneath the surface of the water. The portion that extended into the air was perhaps 60 feet high, a jagged peak of ancient ice. It had been smoothed and darkened by its long journey, creating a phenomenon known as black ice. Without a moon to reflect off its surface, and with no breaking water at its base, the berg was practically invisible against the starless sky. The routine of the ship continued below decks. The passengers slept comfortably in their heated cabins, unaware of the cold that surrounded them. The stokers continued to shovel coal into the furnaces, and the engines continued their rhythmic thumping. The ship moved forward with the unstoppable momentum of 46,000 tons. The crossing had been defined by a sense of absolute security. It was a belief that the scale of the engineering was sufficient to overcome any obstacle the natural world might present. It was a confidence born of an era that had seen the rapid conquering of distance and the steady improvement of material comfort. The silence of the cold horizon was absolute. It was broken only by the rush of water along the hull and the faint hum of the wind in the rigging. The Titanic was a small, illuminated island in a vast expanse of darkness. It was an intrusion of light and noise into a region that had been empty for millennia. The optical illusion of the false horizon persisted, holding the secret of the ice until the very last moment. The lookouts stared into the void, their eyes straining against the cold, searching for a shape that the ocean refused to reveal. The moment before the sighting was characterized not by a sense of impending doom, but by the steady, unvarying rhythm of the passage. The ship was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, moving at high speed across the surface of the ocean. The cold was simply a condition to be managed. The darkness was a temporary state to be endured until the morning. The horizon remained empty, a flat line that promised a continued journey toward the warm lights of New York. It was a promise that was about to be violently broken. Chapter 9: The 1140 Shudder. 11:30 at night found the Titanic moving with a steady, quiet momentum through a sea that had become almost preternaturally still. Most of the passengers had retired to their staterooms. The lights in the grand saloons were dimmed to a soft amber glow that reflected off the polished mahogany and brass fixtures. The ship was a self-contained world of warmth and safety. It drove through a darkness so profound that the only evidence of movement was the white foam churning at the bow and the cold wind in the rigging. On the bridge, the silence was absolute. It was broken only by the occasional low murmur of the officers and the faint rhythmic ticking of the master clock. Within the bridge house, First Officer William Murdoch stood his watch with a calm, professional focus. His eyes occasionally scanned the dark horizon beyond the glass. Murdoch was a man of the sea, an experienced mariner with a reputation for cool-headedness in moments of pressure. He was aware of the ice reports, but like the rest of the crew, he placed his trust in the clarity of the night and the sheer physical presence of the vessel. The ship felt unshakable, a weight of steel that moved with a certainty that seemed to defy the natural unpredictability of the ocean. Frederick Fleet, stationed in the crow's nest nearly 100 feet above the water, felt the cold as a physical barrier. He and his fellow lookout, Reginald Lee, had been staring into the blackness for over an hour, their eyes straining to find any disruption in the star field. The air was so still that there was no sound of waves breaking against the hull. There was only the rushing sound of the ship's own passage through the water. It was at 11:39 p.m. that Fleet noticed something in the darkness. It was not a white peak, but a blacker mass that seemed to occupy a hole in the stars directly ahead. The sighting was initially a mere suggestion of a shape, a shadow that felt more substantial than the void around it. As the ship closed the distance at 22 knots, the shadow resolved into a jagged, upright wall of ice that towered over the surface of the water. Fleet did not hesitate, reaching for the lanyard of the heavy brass bell that hung in the crow's nest. He pulled the cord 3 times, the deep, resonant metallic clangs echoing through the cold air and down to the bridge below. The sound was a jarring intrusion into the silence of the night. It was a signal that everyone in the merchant service understood as object directly ahead. Fleet then stepped to the telephone that connected him to the bridge, waiting for the few seconds it took for 6th Officer James Moody to pick up the receiver. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet reported, his voice calm despite the adrenaline that must have been surging through him. He received the polite reply, "Thank you," before the line went dead. Murdoch, hearing the bells and receiving the report, moved with a decisive speed that was the product of years of training and instinct. He looked out from the bridge wing and saw the iceberg, a looming mountain of dark ice that was now only seconds away from the bow. He immediately ordered the helmsman to put the wheel hard a starboard. Under the maritime rules of 1912, this meant the ship's stern would swing to starboard and the bow would turn to port. Simultaneously, he reached for the engine room telegraphs, pulling the brass levers to full astern. He attempted to slow the ship's momentum and assist the turn. 37 seconds elapsed between the 3 bells and the moment of contact. It was a fleeting span of time during which the massive inertia of the Titanic fought against the rudder's attempt to pivot the hull. The ship began to swing slowly to port, the bow narrowly clearing the main body of the berg. It loomed over the side like a dark cathedral of frozen water. For a heartbeat, it appeared that the maneuver might succeed, that the ship would glide past the ice with only inches to spare. But the portion of the iceberg visible above the water was only a fraction of its total mass. Beneath the surface, a jagged spur of ancient ice waited for the steel. Impact was not a violent crash, but a low-pitched, grinding vibration that ran along the starboard side of the hull. It was a sound that many described as the tearing of heavy silk or the dragging of a giant finger across the steel plates. The iceberg did not pierce the ship with a single blow. Instead, it scraped along the side for nearly 300 feet. The pressure of the collision popped the rivets and buckled the plates below the waterline. This lateral scraping was far more devastating than a head-on collision would have been. It opened the ship's first 5 compartments to the sea simultaneously. Large chunks of ice, some as big as suitcases, were sheared off the berg by the force of the contact and tumbled onto the forward well deck. The ice was a stark crystalline white against the dark paint of the ship. It was a cold intrusion from the natural world that sat incongruously near the third-class entrance. 1 or 2 passengers examining the fragments were unaware that this material was the evidence of a wound that had already doomed the ship. While the sensation on the bridge was a quiet shudder, the experience in the lower decks was more pronounced. In the forward boiler rooms and the mail room, The collision was felt as a dull thud, followed by the immediate roaring sound of incoming water. The sea did not leak into the Titanic. It surged in under immense pressure. It was a cold, black torrent that began to fill the lower spaces with a terrifying speed. The stokers and the postal clerks found themselves suddenly knee-deep in the Atlantic. Their routine was replaced by a frantic scramble to reach the upper levels. William Murdoch immediately pulled the switch to close the watertight doors throughout the ship. A series of bells rang out in the engine rooms, warning the men below that the massive steel barriers were about to descend. The doors moved slowly on their hydraulic tracks, sealing the compartments. It was a mechanical response to a catastrophe that was already outstripping the ship's design. It was a quiet closing of the gates that would ultimately trap the water and the ship in a state of terminal imbalance. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge seconds after the vibration had ceased, having felt the unusual movement from his cabin. He and Murdoch stood together in the quiet of the bridge, looking out over the dark water as the ship's speed began to bleed away. "What have we struck?" Smith asked, his voice steady and low. Murdoch explained the sighting and the maneuver, noting that the ice had scraped the side. There was no smoke, no fire, and no immediate sign of disaster on the upper decks. Yet the ship began to list slightly to starboard as the engines came to a complete halt. Silence followed the stopping of the engines, a profound and unsettling quiet that seemed to settle over the ship like a shroud. The rhythmic thumping of the pistons, which had been the heartbeat of the voyage, was gone. It was replaced by the faint sound of steam escaping from the relief valves. The Titanic was now adrift, a massive island of steel and light, sitting motionless in the center of the ice field. Passengers who had been woken by the shudder stepped out into the corridors in their dressing gowns. They asked the stewards why the ship had stopped, their voices carrying a tone of mild annoyance. Historians often suggest that the very success of the turn was what sealed the ship's fate. Had the Titanic struck the iceberg head-on, the damage would have been confined to the bow. By attempting to port around the obstacle, Murdoch inadvertently exposed the ship's vulnerable side to a long, glancing blow. It was a tragic irony of professional competence, a correct maneuver that led to an impossible outcome. The iceberg itself drifted away into the night, a silent, dark shape that soon vanished back into the gloom. It left behind no trail and no sign of its encounter, save for the fragments of ice on the deck and the jagged openings in the hull. The North Atlantic remained flat and indifferent, its surface reflecting the stars as if nothing had happened. The ship sat in the middle of this stillness, a brightly lit monument that was slowly beginning to settle into the water. Steam continued to hiss from the funnels, a white plume of vapor that rose high into the cold air. The sound was a constant, rushing roar that made conversation difficult on the boat deck. It added to the sense of disorientation for those who had just woken. The routine of the crossing was gone, replaced by a new, uncertain reality. The 1140 shudder had passed, and the slow mathematical process of the sinking had begun. Chapter 10: The Unyielding Math. The structural reality of the collision was not defined by a singular, catastrophic breach. It was a series of narrow, intermittent gashes that spanned the first 300 feet of the starboard hull. Submerged spurs had acted as a serrated blade, popping rivets and buckling the heavy steel plates just enough to allow the Atlantic to enter. These openings, though collectively totaling only about 12 square feet, were positioned across 5 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. This specific distribution of damage created a mathematical problem for which there was no operational solution. The Titanic had been designed to remain afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but never the first 5. Thomas Andrews arrived on the bridge within minutes of the impact, carrying a bundle of rolled blueprints. He understood the vessel in terms of displacement, buoyancy, and structural load. He listened to the reports of the officers with a quiet, analytical focus. Captain Smith requested a joint inspection of the forward holds. Together they descended into the interior of the ship, moving away from the quiet luxury toward the rising water below. They moved through the labyrinth of crew stairs and service corridors, their shadows flickering against the white-painted steel. The electric lights hummed with a steady, oblivious energy. Moving through the lower decks, the 2 men encountered the first visible evidence of the ship's mounting distress. Near the mail sorting room on G deck, the air was damp and smelled of wet paper and salt. The sound of rushing water was a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated through the floorboards. The water was already several feet deep in the mail hold, swirling around the heavy wooden sorting tables. It was soaking the thousands of canvas sacks that had been loaded so carefully at Queenstown. The sight was a jarring intrusion of the ocean into the orderly world of the Postal Service. Deep in the flooding mailroom, 5 postal clerks were engaged in a desperate and ultimately futile effort. They struggled to save the mail from the rising tide. These men waded waist-deep in the freezing water, dragging the heavy, waterlogged sacks of registered mail toward the upper sorting levels. It was a miniature of quiet, industrial heroism, a group of men performing a mundane task with life-or-death urgency. The Atlantic continued to pour in through the buckled seams of the hull. A total area of damage no larger than a standard office desk was all it took to admit hundreds of tons of water every minute. Because the gashes were located so deep below the waterline, the pressure of the ocean was immense. Water was forced through the narrow openings with the force of a hydraulic jet. This pressure ensured that the flooding was a relentless inundation that overwhelmed the bilge pumps. The engineers in the lower compartments realized early on that they were fighting a battle against physics. They continued to manage the valves and the electrical switchgear with a stoic, mechanical discipline. If only the first 4 compartments had been breached, the ship would have remained on an even enough keel for the bulkheads to hold. However, the flooding of the 5th compartment, Boiler Room 6, meant that the bow would eventually pull the ship down. The sea would reach the top of the bulkheads, which ended at E deck. This allowed the water to simply spill over from one compartment into the next, much like an ice cube tray tilted at an angle. This design choice was the unyielding math that would determine the ship's final hours. At this depth of flooding, the bow was already beginning to lose its natural buoyancy. Thomas Andrews calculated with terrifying precision that the sinking was no longer a question of if, but when. Standing in the quiet of the bridge, he delivered his assessment to Captain Smith in a calm, flat tone. He estimated that the ship had an hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours at most, before the sea claimed it entirely. Andrews stood as the ultimate arbiter of the ship's fate, his expertise providing a clarity that the other officers were still struggling to accept. There was no emotion in his delivery, only the cold reality of the engineering he had helped to oversee. Captain Smith received the news with a quiet, stunned gravity. His mind likely turned to the 2,200 souls on board and the 20 lifeboats that hung in the davits. The bridge, which had been a place of absolute authority, was suddenly a room where the occupants were merely witnesses. They were watching an unstoppable physical process that cared nothing for human intent. Behind the closed doors of the forward boiler rooms, the stokers and firemen were witnessing the math in its most visceral form. When the water breached the coal bunkers, the cold surge against hot furnaces created clouds of scalding steam. The men were forced to retreat through the watertight doors just as they were sliding shut. They moved into Boiler Room 5 to begin the urgent task of drawing the fires. They fought to prevent the boilers from exploding as the water continued its steady upward climb. It was a quiet irony that the watertight doors became a psychological barrier that masked the true extent of the damage from the passengers. Because the flooding was contained in the lowest levels, the upper decks remained dry and seemingly secure. Many passengers returned to their beds or sat in the lounges, convinced that the shudder was merely a minor inconvenience. This disconnect between the lower holds and the upper decks created a dangerous sense of complacency. It delayed the start of the evacuation by those most in need of haste. For every foot the bow sank, the stern rose by an almost imperceptible degree. This shifted the ship's center of gravity and placed immense stress on the longitudinal girders of the hull. The change in trim was subtle at first, recognizable only to the officers who noticed the slight tilt of the decks. In the gymnasium, the water in the swimming pool began to slosh toward the forward end. The pool became a large tiled indicator of the ship's impending collapse. As the water filled the pool and spilled out, the architecture of luxury began to dissolve. While the officers began to organize the crew, the interior of the ship remained a place of eerie, artificial stillness. The stewards moved through the first-class corridors, knocking softly on doors and advising passengers to put on their life belts. Their voices were calm, echoing the professional poise expected of the White Star service. Yet their eyes often betrayed the anxiety of men who knew more than they were permitted to say. The passengers, still insulated by warmth, often joked with the stewards as they tied the heavy cork belts over their evening wear. The 5 postal clerks continued their work in the mailroom for as long as the electric lights remained functional. They were eventually forced to abandon the lower sorting room as the water reached the ceiling. They retreated to the upper decks with whatever registered mail they could carry. They had remained at their posts long after the engineers had abandoned the hold. It was a testament to an Edwardian duty that placed the requirements of the institution above personal safety. Their labor was a quiet, doomed struggle against a rising tide. Within 45 minutes of the impact, the water had reached the level of the squash court on F deck. The wooden floor warped and buckled as the salt water soaked into the grain. Balls and rackets were swept away in the dark surge. This was the steady progression of the flood. Room by room, deck by deck, the ship's interior was being reclaimed. The math was working its way upward, a leveling force that ignored the distinctions of ticket price. Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews returned to the bridge to begin the next phase of the crisis. The distress signals were ordered to be sent via wireless, and the crew was instructed to begin uncovering the lifeboats. There was no more time for inspection or calculation. The unyielding math had provided its final answer. The Titanic sat low in the water, its bow pointed downward into the darkness, a 26,000-ton weight at the mercy of the Atlantic. Gravity and displacement, the twin forces that had allowed the ship to exist, were now the instruments of its destruction. Every ton of water that entered the hull made the next ton enter more quickly. The ship was a magnificent machine being slowly dismantled by the very element it was built to cross. As the first rockets were prepared, the silence of the North Atlantic seemed to deepen. It was a vast, cold theater waiting for the final act of the floating palace. Chapter 11: The Protocol of the Boats. The Board of Trade's regulations regarding maritime safety had been formulated in an era when the size of a vessel was significantly smaller than the modern liners. These rules, established primarily under the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894, utilized a calculation of tonnage rather than passenger capacity to determine the number of lifeboats. Because the Titanic was nearly 3 times the size of the vessels envisioned by the original regulators, the law required only enough boat space for approximately 960 people. The White Star Line had actually exceeded these legal requirements by providing 20 boats. These boats had a total capacity of 1,178. Yet this figure remained a quiet mathematical inadequacy when measured against the 2,200 souls on board. Safety on the North Atlantic was traditionally viewed through the lens of the ship itself acting as its own primary lifeboat. This philosophy was reinforced by the advent of watertight compartments and double hulls. Lifeboats were regarded by many naval architects as instruments for transferring passengers from a distressed vessel to a rescuing one. They were not seen as a means of independent survival in the open sea. This institutional confidence led to a boat deck that was designed for aesthetic openness and social gathering. The presence of too many wooden hulls was seen as an unnecessary clutter that would obscure the views of the wealthy. The 20 boats that did exist, 16 wooden lifeboats, and 4 Engelhart collapsible rafts, were clustered in groups. This left vast stretches of the promenade open to the cold night air. Captain Smith issued the order to uncover the lifeboats at approximately 12:05 a.m. This command signaled the official transition from a maritime accident to a structured evacuation. The crew moved with a disciplined, if somewhat hesitant, rhythm to strip away the white canvas covers and clear the falls. These were the heavy ropes used to lower the boats into the sea. Many of the sailors had only joined the ship days before in Southampton. They were unfamiliar with the specific mechanical quirks of the Titanic's Welland davits. They worked by the light of the electric lamps, their breath visible in the freezing air. They struggled with the stiff, salt-encrusted lines and the heavy wooden blocks. Distress rockets began to climb into the black sky from the bridge wing. They were sent up by 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall at regular intervals to signal the ship's location. Each rocket ascended with a soft, rushing hiss before blossoming into a brilliant white flash. The light illuminated the four funnels and the silent, watching crowds on the deck for a fleeting second. The light was beautiful and terrible. It was a silent plea for assistance that arced over the flat water and vanished into the darkness without a sound. These were the standard signals of distress. Yet to many of the passengers watching from below, they appeared more like a festive display. This interpretation further delayed the arrival of a true sense of urgency. Second Officer Charles Lightoller took command of the evacuation on the port side of the boat deck. He was an officer who interpreted the captain's orders with a literal and unyielding rigor. He adopted a protocol of women and children only. This was a directive that meant he would allow no men to board the lifeboats. He maintained this even if there was vacant space available when the boat was ready to be lowered. Lightoller was a man of the old school. He possessed a belief in the necessity of sacrifice and the preservation of the most vulnerable. This was the absolute moral baseline of the sea. His side of the ship became a place of quiet, orderly partings. The social hierarchies of the era were reinforced through the act of standing back and allowing others to lead. First Officer William Murdoch, overseeing the starboard side, operated under a slightly more flexible interpretation. He used the protocol of women and children first. This allowed men to fill the remaining seats once all available women and children had boarded. This difference in command style meant that the starboard boats often left the ship more fully loaded. However, even here, the initial launches were characterized by a deep, lingering disbelief. Many passengers were reluctant to leave the warmth and light of the ship. They hesitated to enter the small, uncertain refuge of a wooden boat suspended over 60 feet of dark water. They viewed the Titanic as a solid, permanent island. The Atlantic, by contrast, appeared as a vast and lethal void. Music began to drift across the boat deck as Wallace Hartley and his 7 fellow musicians gathered in the first-class lounge. They played a selection of upbeat ragtime and classical melodies. They were dressed in their formal uniforms, their instruments gleaming under the chandeliers. They performed with a professional poise that seemed to ignore the increasing list of the floor beneath them. Hartley, a man who understood the psychological power of melody, intended the music to act as a stabilizing force. It was a way of masking the mechanical groans of the hull. The sound of the violins and the cello provided a fragile layer of civilization over the raw reality of the sinking. This gesture of grace persisted for over 2 hours. The social reality of the third-class passengers was defined by a difficult and confusing journey from the lower decks. The path toward the boat deck was often blocked by locked gates and a lack of clear direction. While first-class passengers were being ushered into boats by attentive stewards, many of the emigrants were still navigating the Scotland Road corridor. They carried their children and their small bundles of belongings. They moved upward through the ship as the water followed them. Their progress was a testament to their persistence in the face of a system that had not fully accounted for them. The gates were eventually opened or bypassed, but for many, the arrival on the boat deck occurred only after the majority of the lifeboats had already departed. In the vicinity of Lifeboat 8, a quiet negotiation occurred between Ida and Isidore Strauss. They were the elderly couple who owned Macy's department store in New York. As the officers urged Ida to board the boat, she paused and turned to her husband. He stood beside her with a calm, accepting dignity. She refused to leave him, stating with a quiet finality that they had lived together for many years. She told him that where he went, she would go also. Isidore was offered a seat by the officers in deference to his age and stature, but he declined to board. He would not go while younger men remained on the deck. They moved together to a pair of deck chairs, sitting side by side in the cold. As the boat was lowered away, they remained together in a private moment of devotion. Lifeboat 7 was the first to be lowered into the sea at 12:45 a.m. It carried only 28 people in a vessel designed to hold 65. This pattern of half-empty boats continued for much of the first hour. It was a consequence of the lack of centralized information and the belief that the ship would remain afloat. The crew, fearful that the davits would buckle under a full load, were hesitant to crowd the boats. They intended to pick up more passengers from the lower gangway doors. These doors, however, were never opened. This left the early boats to drift away with dozens of empty seats that could never be reclaimed. Crew training for such a catastrophe had been minimal. No boat drill had been held on the Sunday morning prior to the impact, as was often the custom. The sailors and stewards worked with a manual that was being written in real time. Their actions were governed more by individual character than by institutional preparation. Some officers, like Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, demonstrated a fierce, proactive leadership. He moved between the boats to ensure the falls were properly handled and the passengers correctly seated. Lowe would later become the only officer to organize a return to the debris field to search for survivors. It was a decision that reflected a personal commitment to the responsibilities of his rank. Distress rockets continued to fire, their white trails reflecting in the windows of the staterooms. Inside, the lights still burned with a defiant amber brilliance. The engineers below decks had remained at their posts, managing the dynamos. They ensured that the ship stayed illuminated for as long as possible. This light was a vital psychological tool, preventing the panic that often accompanies darkness. It allowed the evacuation to proceed with a degree of order. The cost of this light was the presence of the men in the engine rooms. They watched the water rise around the massive pistons while they maintained the flow of electricity. The creak of the davits and the rhythmic chanting of the sailors became the dominant sound. It was a mechanical liturgy of the sinking. As the bow settled deeper, the angle of the ropes changed. This made the process of lowering the boats increasingly difficult and dangerous. The wooden hulls would often scrape against the side of the ship. The sound of the friction was a harsh, grinding noise that echoed through the empty cabins. Passengers in the boats looked back at the towering wall of the Titanic. It now appeared as a cliff of light, leaning preciously toward the water. The transition from disbelief to a frantic urgency occurred as the final boats were prepared. The realization that there were not enough seats began to permeate the crowds. This led to a tightening of the atmosphere and a more focused effort to fill the remaining spaces. The women and children protocol was enforced with more vigor. The partings became more hurried, the final words between families lost in the rush of the launch. The ship was no longer a palace. It was a weight pulling everyone down. The lifeboats were the only fragments of the world that remained buoyant. The boat deck was eventually left with only the 4 Engelhart collapsible rafts. They sat on the roofs of the officers' quarters and required a desperate manual effort to slide down. By this time, the water had reached the forward end of the boat deck. The sea was beginning to wash over the bridge where Captain Smith stood. The protocol of the boats had reached its limit. The math of the disaster was now fully visible to everyone remaining on the ship. The lifeboats were small, white specks on the dark Atlantic. They moved away from the light of the Titanic toward the cold silence of the horizon. Chapter 12: The Final Descent. Wallace Hartley and his fellow musicians remained on the sloping boat deck. They stayed long after the final wooden lifeboat had been lowered into the darkness. Their presence was a steady, melodic anchor in a world that was rapidly dissolving. The music they played had transitioned from upbeat ragtime to slower, contemplative hymns. The sound of the strings carried over the water with a clarity that survivors would never forget. There is a persistent historical debate regarding the final piece performed. Whether it was Nearer My God to Thee or Song d'Automne, the specific title mattered less than the act. It was a professional commitment to the very end. It was a refusal to allow the silence of the Atlantic to reclaim the ship before the water did. Water began to lap at the base of the forward funnel at approximately 2:05 a.m. This cold, black surge signaled the final minutes of the ship's life as a unified structure. The bridge where Captain Smith had spent his final hours of command was now entirely submerged. The telegraphs and the wheelhouse disappeared beneath the surface with a bubbling efficiency. Those remaining on the deck moved toward the stern. It was rising steadily into the air as the weight of the flooded bow pulled the ship downward. The angle of the decks became so steep that it was nearly impossible to maintain a footing. People were forced to cling to the railings and the heavy machinery of the davits. Within the bowels of the ship, the engineers and electricians led by Joseph Bell continued their work. They ensured that the lights remained burning until the very last moment. This was a feat of immense technical and personal discipline. They remained in the heat and shadow while the sea pressed against the bulkheads just yards away. The lights held their amber brilliance with a defiant constancy. They illuminated the towering hull and the surrounding ice field. It was only when the water reached the upper electrical panels that the ship was plunged into darkness. Only the cold starlight remained to light the scene. A low subterranean roar began to vibrate through the hull as the ship reached a critical angle. The massive boilers and heavy machinery were breaking loose from their mountings. This was a slow, grinding relocation of thousands of tons of metal sliding toward the bow. The physical stress on the central section was exceeding the limits of its design. The double-bottomed hull acted as a pivot point for the immense forces of gravity and buoyancy. The ship was being pulled in 2 directions at once. The water-filled bow was dragging it down, while the air-filled stern resisted the descent. One might consider the final moments of a great vessel as a series of structural surrenders. The Titanic reached a point where the material could no longer sustain the geometry of the hull. Between the 3rd and 4th funnels, the superstructure began to buckle. The heavy rivets popped under the tension with a sound like distant gunfire. The ship parted in two. The bow pulled away and began its long, solitary glide toward the seabed. The stern settled back momentarily into the water before its own final plunge. The end of the structure was near. Charles Jowin, the ship's chief baker, found himself at the very center of this transition. His journey from the kitchens to the sea became a remarkable chronicle of the night. He had spent the preceding hours organizing bread for the lifeboats and fortifying himself with spirits. Jowin moved toward the stern as the bow disappeared. He found himself on the extreme end of the vessel, climbing over the railing and standing on the hull. He waited with a curious, detached calm as the stern rose vertically. He watched the dark water rise to meet him as if he were standing on a moving elevator. As the stern reached its final vertical position, Jowin felt the ship begin to slide beneath him. It moved with a smoothness that left no wake and no suction. He stepped off the hull and into the water without even wetting his hair. The alcohol in his system perhaps provided a buffer against the immediate shock. He began to tread water in the darkness, a lone figure in a white baker's tunic. He watched the bubbles rise from the spot where the Titanic had been just seconds before. Jowin would survive for hours in the freezing sea. He was a testament to the strange ways a human body can resist the math of the cold. The final plunge of the stern occurred at 2:20 a.m. It was marked by the disappearance of the gilded lettering on the counter. The propellers tilted slowly toward the stars. The ship did not go down with a roar, but with muffled thuds and the rushing sound of escaping air. Once the water closed over the stern, a profound and heavy silence settled over the North Atlantic. This stillness expanded to fill the void left by the massive vessel. The Titanic was gone. It left behind only a field of white debris and the hundreds of voices crying out in the darkness. Everything that had been the pride of the White Star Line was now in a state of violent descent. The Axminster carpets, the oak carvings, and the silver-plated lamps fell through the deep. As the bow fell, it reached a terminal velocity that stripped away the loose fittings. It compressed the air within the hull until the bulkheads collapsed inward. The bow plowed into the silt of the ocean floor at nearly 30 miles per hour. It buried itself deep in the mud, creating a massive cloud of sediment. The stern followed a more chaotic path, spinning as it fell. It shed a debris field that would eventually span several square miles. 12,500 feet of water now sat between the ship and the surface. This depth represented a pressure of over 6,000 pounds per square inch. This was a region of absolute darkness and perpetual cold. Here, the rhythms of the seasons and the movements of the winds had no meaning. The Titanic had moved from the world of human history to the world of geology. It settled into the ancient ooze of the abyssal plain. The material reality was being crushed and preserved by the weight of the sea. It would remain hidden from the world for the next 73 years. A human-scale detail that persisted was the sudden stopping of the watches and clocks. Thousands of small mechanical heartbeats ceased at the moment of immersion. These frozen moments of time were captured in gold and silver cases. They would eventually be recovered from the silt, their hands pointing to the early morning hours. They were silent witnesses to the finality of the descent. They marked the exact second when terrestrial life met the reality of the Atlantic. It is notable how quickly the ocean attempts to smooth over the disruption of a sinking. Within minutes, the flat surface of the sea returned to its glassy state. It reflected the stars as if the ship had never existed. The only evidence was the thin layer of wreckage, wooden deck chairs, and cork lifebelts. These fragments bobbed in the center of the ice field. The cold remained absolute, a silent force that began to claim the survivors. The site of the sinking became a quiet, frozen cemetery. Hartley and his musicians were gone, their instruments lost to the depths. Yet the echo of their music remained a focal point for those in the lifeboats. They sat in the small wooden craft, huddled together against the chill. They watched the empty spot on the horizon where the lights had once burned. The transition from the warm, vibrant life to the cold reality of the boats was a shock. They were now travelers in a very different sense, moving slowly through the ice. The final descent was the end of an era of absolute confidence. The belief in the permanence of material achievement was shattered by the physics of the ocean. The ship was now a wreck, a monument of iron resting in the eternal darkness. As the first light of morning touched the horizon, the North Atlantic remained indifferent. The history had reached its point of rest. The silence of the deep water was all that remained. Chapter 13: The Lights of the Carpathia. The darkness that followed the sinking was profound, a vast and featureless void broken only by the hard diamond glint of the stars and the occasional unsettling luminescence of the icebergs passing like pale ghosts in the current. In the lifeboats, the initial hours were characterized by a stunned silence. The passengers and crew huddled against the biting cold as the reality of their situation began to harden into focus. They were scattered across miles of open ocean, small clusters of humanity floating above an abyss that had just swallowed the largest moving object ever built by man. The sea was perfectly calm, a mill pond stillness that offered no resistance, yet its temperature of 28 degrees made every drop of water a hazard to those trying to maintain their body heat. 100 miles to the southeast, the Cunard liner Carpathia was cutting through the night with a desperate singular focus. Captain Arthur Rostron, upon receiving the Titanic's distress call from his wireless operator, had not hesitated to alter course. This immediate and decisive action transformed his modest passenger ship into a floating rescue operation. The Carpathia was a smaller, older vessel than the Titanic, designed for a steady 14 knots. Yet on this night, driven by the urgency of the moment and the skill of her engineers, she achieved a speed of over 17 knots. The ship shuddered under the strain, her boilers pressed to their absolute limits as she dashed headlong into the same ice field that had claimed her rival. Rostron's preparations during the 3-hour dash were a masterclass in disciplined foresight. He organized the ship to receive hundreds of traumatized survivors long before the first lifeboat was even sighted. He ordered the ship's heating system diverted from the cabins to the public spaces, turning the dining saloons and lounges into warm receiving areas. The kitchens were mobilized to prepare vast quantities of hot soup and coffee. The smell of the broth began to replace the usual scent of polish and sea air. Every spare blanket, coat, and piece of heavy linen was gathered by the stewards and placed near the gangways. They anticipated the immediate physical needs of those exposed to the freezing Atlantic. It is notable how the structure of a ship changes when its purpose shifts from transit to triage. The Carpathia's crew strung canvas slings from the davits, preparing to hoist children and injured passengers directly from the lifeboats. Heavy cargo nets were draped over the sides to provide a climbing surface for those able to manage it. The first-class passengers, woken by the sudden change in the ship's rhythm, found their usual routines suspended. They were enlisted to clear the public rooms and offer their own cabins to the survivors. This was an act of shared humanity that temporarily dissolved the rigid class boundaries of the era. In the lifeboats, the long hours before dawn were an exercise in endurance. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, commanding Lifeboat 2, periodically ignited green flares. These sudden bursts of emerald light provided brief moments of orientation for the scattered fleet. The light revealed the faces of the survivors, pale, exhausted, and often locked in expressions of quiet grief. The cold was a constant, aching presence, seeping through the heavy wool coats and freezing the seawater that had splashed into the bottoms of the boats. Some rowed simply to generate heat, their movements stiff and uncoordinated in the cramped space. Others sat in silence, watching the horizon for any sign of a rescuing light. The first hint of the Carpathia's approach came just before dawn, a faint rhythmic thumping that seemed to carry through the water itself. Then, the lights of the ship became visible. As the liner slowed, firing rockets of her own to signal her arrival, a collective sigh seemed to pass over the lifeboats. The sky began to lighten, revealing the vast expanse of the ice field, a landscape of shattered white plains and towering bergs that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Carpathia navigated this treacherous terrain with cautious grace, her black hull and single red funnel acting as a beacon of safety in the growing dawn light. Arthur Rostron ordered the engines stopped at 4 a.m., positioning the Carpathia carefully among the ice floes to begin the delicate process of boarding the survivors. Lifeboat 2 was the first to arrive at the side of the liner, bumping softly against the steel plates as the crew lowered the nets and slings. The transfer was a slow, deliberate operation. The silence of the morning was broken only by the creak of the ropes and the quiet commands of the officers. Many of the survivors were too cold to climb, their hands numb and their bodies rigid. They were hoisted in canvas bags like precious cargo. The transition from the small wooden boats to the solid deck of the Carpathia was a profound relief. Yet it was also the moment when the full scale of the loss became apparent. As the survivors were wrapped in warm blankets and handed cups of hot soup, they began to search the faces of those coming aboard. They looked for husbands, sons, and friends who had been left behind. The silence of the boats was replaced by the low murmur of questions and the sudden, sharp realization of absence. The warm dining saloons of the Carpathia became spaces of quiet mourning, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and the heavy weight of loss. J. Bruce Ismay, having survived the sinking by securing a seat in one of the final collapsible boats, boarded the Carpathia and immediately retreated to the doctor's cabin. He remained there for the duration of the return voyage, a broken man who refused to eat or speak to anyone. He was unable to reconcile the reality of the disaster with the ambition that had driven the creation of the liners. His silence was a stark contrast to the activity around him. The man who had sketched the profile of the world's largest ship on a napkin was now a silent passenger on a much smaller vessel. The recovery operation continued until nearly 8:30 a.m., when the last of the survivors from the waterlogged collapsible B were brought aboard. The final tally was 705 rescued, out of over 2,200 who had sailed. This devastating ratio underscored the inadequacy of the lifeboat provision. Captain Rostron ordered a slow sweep of the area, the Carpathia moving carefully through the debris field in the hope of finding anyone still alive. They found only empty boats, wooden deck chairs, and the silent, frozen bodies of those who had succumbed to the cold. Their life belts held them upright in the still water. With the hope of further rescue extinguished, Rostron ordered the Carpathia's engines turned toward New York. The ship moved slowly through the ice with its heavy burden of survivors. The voyage back was a solemn procession, the ship's wireless humming constantly. Harold Bride worked with the Carpathia's operator to transmit the names of the rescued to the waiting world. The air was thick with the static of the atmosphere and the sheer volume of inquiries from the shore. The quiet routine of the crossing had been permanently replaced by the noise of a global tragedy. The Carpathia was a floating hospital and a sanctuary of grief. Its crew worked tirelessly to comfort the survivors and manage the logistical challenges of a massive increase in population. The first-class passengers of the Titanic mingled with the third-class emigrants. The social barriers of the era were momentarily erased by the shared experience of survival. They slept on the floors of the lounges, shared clothing, and sat together in silence. They were bound by the memory of the 1140 shudder and the slow descent of the great ship. The focus was entirely on the present moment. The warmth of the blankets, the taste of the coffee, and the steady vibration of the engines pulling them toward land. Thursday evening, April 18, brought the Carpathia to the mouth of the Hudson River. She moved slowly through a heavy rain and a thick fog. The arrival in New York was not the triumphant entrance that had been planned for the Titanic. It was a quiet, somber docking accompanied by the flash of photographers' bulbs. Thousands of people waited in the rain, hoping for a glimpse of a loved one or simply standing in witness to the scale of the loss. The city that had prepared to celebrate a triumph of engineering was now tasked with receiving the survivors of its greatest failure. As the gangways were lowered, the survivors began the slow process of disembarking, stepping back onto the solid earth for the first time in over a week. The transition was jarring. The noise and the lights of the city were a stark contrast to the silence and the darkness of the North Atlantic. They moved through the crowds with a weary grace, carrying the few belongings they had managed to save. The Carpathia had completed her dash and delivered her cargo. She left the survivors to begin the difficult work of piecing their lives back together in a world irrevocably changed. Chapter 14: The Sea of Inquiry. The arrival of the Carpathia in New York initiated a period of intense public and political scrutiny. There was an immediate need to translate the silence of the disaster into a coherent narrative of failure. The sheer scale of the loss shattered the Edwardian confidence in technological supremacy. It demanded an accounting of the decisions made in the boardrooms of London and the shipyards of Belfast. Within 24 hours, the United States Senate convened a special investigative committee. This rapid response was driven by public outcry and the presence of prominent citizens among the dead. The focus shifted from the material reality of the ship to the abstract world of regulation, blame, and maritime law. Senator William Alden Smith chaired the American inquiry, conducting the hearings with a populist zeal that often frustrated the British maritime professionals. The hearings were held initially in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. This setting of deep carpets and heavy chandeliers provided an incongruous backdrop to the testimony of freezing water. Smith focused his questioning heavily on J. Bruce Ismay. He pressed the director on issues of speed, ice warnings, and the decision to board a lifeboat while others remained. The atmosphere was charged with the tension of accountability. The quiet luxury of the hotel room served as a courtroom for the corporate decisions that governed the voyage. Testimony from the surviving officers, particularly Second Officer Charles Lightoller, provided a detailed account of the ship's final hours. Lightoller defended the actions of Captain Smith and the crew, emphasizing the suddenness of the disaster and the limitations of the ship's design. He spoke of the calm discipline that had characterized the evacuation. It was a narrative that sought to preserve the dignity of the maritime profession. The inquiry was an attempt to impose logic on an event that had defied it. It was a slow parsing of the unyielding math that had doomed the vessel. A parallel inquiry convened in London shortly after, led by Lord Mersey. He possessed a thorough understanding of maritime law. The British investigation focused on systemic failures rather than individual blame. They examined the role of the Board of Trade and the design of the watertight compartments. The testimony here was technical and precise, a post-mortem of the ship's engineering. It confirmed Thomas Andrews' chilling assessment of the damage. The consequences of these inquiries were sweeping and immediate. They resulted in the most significant overhaul of maritime safety regulations in history. The most visible change was the mandate that all passenger vessels must carry sufficient lifeboats for every person on board. This signaled the end of the era where the ship was considered its own primary lifeboat. This requirement fundamentally altered the design of ocean liners. Boat decks were soon cluttered with double-tiered davits and banks of wooden hulls. The aesthetic elegance was replaced by the pragmatic requirements of survival. It was a visual acknowledgement that the sea remained an unpredictable environment. Furthermore, the inquiries highlighted the critical role of wireless communication. This led to the requirement that all passenger ships maintain a 24-hour radio watch. The failure of the Californian to receive distress calls was recognized as a tragic missed opportunity. It was a silence that could not be allowed to happen again. This regulation ensured that the ether would be continuously monitored. It created a permanent, invisible web of communication across the shipping lanes. The isolation of the mid-ocean was reduced, replaced by a system of constant vigilance and shared responsibility. The creation of the International Ice Patrol in 1914 was perhaps the most enduring legacy. This was a multinational effort to monitor the movement of icebergs in the North Atlantic. This patrol, funded by maritime nations, replaced the ad hoc system of warnings. They tracked the slow, silent drift of the ice from the Greenland glaciers. This provided a layer of geographical intelligence that allowed captains to alter their courses. The ice field, once a hidden hazard, became a mapped and monitored reality. While the inquiries focused on regulation, a somber effort was underway off Halifax. The goal was to recover the physical evidence of the disaster. The White Star Line chartered cable-laying ships, most notably the Mackay Bennett. They searched the debris field for the bodies of those who had succumbed to the cold. The Mackay Bennett was transformed into a floating morgue, its holds filled with ice and its decks stocked with rough wooden coffins. The crew was now tasked with the grim labor of hauling the dead from the freezing Atlantic. The recovery process was slow and methodical. They moved through a sea thick with wreckage, splintered deck chairs, and pieces of cork. When a body was located, the crew would conduct a meticulous cataloging of personal effects. They searched for identification, letters, or jewelry to return the remains to families. This was a process defined by quiet respect. Those identified as first-class passengers were placed in coffins. The crew and third-class passengers were often sewn into canvas bags. If they could not be identified, they were buried at sea with a brief service. One of the bodies recovered was that of John Jacob Astor. He was identified by the initials sewn into his clothing and the significant amount of cash he carried. The recovery of such a prominent figure underscored the leveling nature of the disaster. Wealth and status provided no insulation against the physical realities of the ocean. The items found: a pocket watch stopped at 2:20 a.m., a waterlogged letter, were the final artifacts. They were silent testaments to the suddenness of the interruption. The sea of inquiry could explain the engineering failures, but it could not articulate the personal loss. The bodies brought back to Halifax were interred in cemeteries across the city. The graves were marked by simple granite blocks bearing only a number and the date. These cemeteries became places of pilgrimage, quiet green spaces that stood in contrast to the dark waters. The city of Halifax became inextricably linked to the memory of the Titanic. It was a terrestrial resting place for those lost at sea. The physical recovery effort was a necessary conclusion to the disaster. It was an attempt to bring order and finality to a chaotic event. Years passed, and the immediate shock began to fade into history. The edges were smoothed by memory and the distraction of the First World War. The Titanic transitioned from a tragedy into a powerful cultural myth. It was a symbol of hubris and the limitations of human endeavor. The regulations enacted in its wake made the sea demonstrably safer, yet the ship itself remained lost, its location a mystery beneath miles of water. The sea of inquiry had run its course. The laws had been changed, and the dead had been buried. The survivors carried the memory of the night with them. Their lives were forever altered by the hours in the boats and the sound of the ship breaking. But the material reality of the Titanic belonged now entirely to the ocean. Its long, slow existence as a deep-sea wreck had begun. Chapter 15: The Resting Place. For 73 years, the Titanic existed only as a memory. She was a collection of fading photographs and the distant recollections of her survivors. The ship itself had vanished, entering a state of absolute isolation on the abyssal plain. She rested in an environment of total darkness and crushing pressure. This was a realm where human history had no traction. The slow processes of geology and deep-sea biology were the only active forces. The exact location remained unknown, a mathematical coordinate lost in the immense scale of the ocean floor. This profound silence was finally broken in the late summer of 1985. An expedition was led by Dr. Robert Ballard and a team from Woods Hole. Ballard's approach was to look for the massive debris field. He searched for the trail the ship had created as it fell through the water column. He utilized a deep-towed sonar and camera sled named Argo. This technology allowed researchers to scan the floor from the comfort of their surface ship. The search was a slow mowing of the seabed, a patient wait for a signal. They waited for anything that would disrupt the endless monotony of the mud. In the early morning hours of September 1, the monitors revealed a change. Grainy black and white images showed smooth, unnatural shapes. The first undeniable piece of the Titanic seen in decades was a massive Scotch boiler. Its rivets and form were perfectly preserved by the cold. The sight in the control room was met with a quiet, stunned reverence. The myth had become a physical reality once again. The resting place had been found. The condition of the wreck provided a visual record of the violence of the descent. The ship had broken apart near the surface, and the sections lay nearly a third of a mile apart. The bow section sat relatively upright in the mud. Its anchors were still in their hawse-peeps, and the bronze capstans gleamed faintly. It retained the recognizable profile of the great liner. It was a silent, majestic ruin that seemed to be pushing forward through the silt. The stern section, however, was a chaotic mass of torn steel. It had been ripped apart by the air trapped inside as it plummeted toward the bottom. The reciprocating engines stood exposed on the torn edges of the hull. These massive monuments were now encrusted with the life of the deep. Between the sections lay the debris field, a sprawling carpet of artifacts. Porcelain teacups, unbroken wine bottles, and crystal chandeliers were scattered there. These items were preserved by the lack of light and oxygen. They lay across the seabed like the contents of a violently overturned dollhouse. A defining characteristic of the wreck was the presence of rusticles. These delicate formations hung from the steel like metallic icicles. They were the work of a species of iron-eating bacteria. This life form was slowly consuming the hull and leaving behind a fragile shell. The Titanic was not merely rusting, it was being absorbed back into the natural cycle. This biological process worked with a patient, unyielding efficiency. Ballard's discovery transformed the Titanic into a tangible archaeological site. It opened the door for expeditions to map the wreck and document the decay. Yet Ballard himself advocated for leaving the ship undisturbed. He viewed the site as a mass grave that should be respected. Pairs of leather shoes lying side by side served as a powerful reminder of the human cost. The resting place was not just a shipwreck, it was a cemetery. As the years progressed, the gradual collapse of the structure was documented. The forward mast eventually collapsed under its own weight. The captain's bathtub disappeared as the surrounding decking gave way. The ship was not frozen in time. It was engaged in a slow act of dying. It was returning to the earth from which its iron had been mined. The history of the Titanic ends here, in the quiet dark. The grand staircases have collapsed, and the oak paneling has been consumed. The massive engines are silent. The ship designed to conquer the Atlantic is now entirely possessed by it. It is a temporary arrangement of steel that is slowly losing its identity. The currents of the deep ocean move slowly through the twisted metal. They carry the fine gray silt that gradually covers the debris field. The water here is near freezing, the pressure immense, and the darkness absolute. There is no sound save for the shifting of the steel as it settles. The ship rests, an artifact of an older time returning to the elements. The journey is complete. Rest well.